The land walls rose before you as they always did, a great layered mass of limestone and brick that had stood for so many generations that no one alive remembered a time without them. From a distance they looked less like a construction and more like a feature of the landscape, a long ridge of pale stone that caught the western light and held it long after the lower streets had fallen into dusk. You approached the military gate that led to your section of the walkway, nodding once to the guard there who recognized you with a slight lift of his chin. The exchange was wordless and comfortable, the kind of acknowledgement that grows between people who share the same quiet duty. You passed through the arch and began the climb up the inner stairs, your hand trailing along the cool, pitted surface of the wall where centuries of other hands had worn shallow grooves into the stone. The stairs emerged onto the parapet walk, a broad platform between the inner and outer walls that stretched away to north and south in a long, perfectly straight line. When you reached the top, the first thing you noticed was the warmth. The stone flags still held the memory of the afternoon sun, and the heat rose through the soles of your sandals, settling into the arches of your feet like a quiet greeting. You walked a few paces to your assigned position, a stretch of battlement between two square towers, and you placed your spear against the crenellation, its iron butt clicking softly against the masonry. The sound was small and brief, swallowed almost immediately by the vast openness of the evening air. You turned then, as you always did at the beginning of a watch, and looked out toward the west. The Thracian countryside spread before you in a broad, gentle sweep of fields and low hills, patched here and there with stands of oak and pine. From this height, a little over 40 feet above the plain, you could see the meandering line of the Lycus River as a dark thread through the greener ground near its banks, and beyond that, the ground rose slowly toward the ridge where the sun was now descending. The sun itself was a flattened disk of deep amber, its light already softening from the hard white glare of midday into something you could look at without squinting. It touched the rooftops of the city behind you, the domes and the bell towers and the flat terraces, and it painted the whole western sky in bands of color that shifted from gold at the horizon to pale rose, then lavender, then a deep, dusty blue directly overhead. You stood still and let the scene settle around you. There was no urgency in this hour, no reason to move or to speak. The evening was calm in the way that early autumn evenings often are, when the heat of summer has passed and the chill of winter is still a distant rumor. A light breeze came from the north, from the direction of the Golden Horn, and it carried with it a faint salt tang and the distant rhythmic creak of a windlass somewhere near the harbor. You draped your cloak over your shoulders, not because you were cold yet, but because the weight of the wool felt right, a familiar presence against your neck and back. The fabric was coarse and undyed, a serviceable brown that matched the hundreds of other cloaks worn by the city's guards, and it smelled of lanolin and of the cedar chest where you kept it during the day. Below you, on the outer side of the wall, the ground sloped down to the wide, dry moat. The moat was empty of water at this time of year, its bottom a tangle of tough grass and wild thyme that had seeded itself in the cracks of the revetment. You could see a few goats grazing there, their bells making a soft, irregular music that drifted up to you in fits and starts. The goater was a boy you had seen many times before, a small figure in a patched tunic who sat on a fallen block of marble near the outer retaining wall, whittling a stick with a curved knife. He never looked up at the guards, and the guards never called down to him. There was an unspoken understanding that the moat was shared ground during the peaceful hours, a place where the city's life spilled gently outward and then receded again before nightfall. Further out, on the dirt road that led to the Golden Gate, a pair of ox carts were making their slow way toward the city. The oxen were dun-colored and patient, their heads bobbing with each step, and the carts behind them were heaped with something covered in canvas, perhaps late hay or sacks of grain from the inland farms. The drivers walked alongside, tapping the beasts with light switches, their voices carrying across the distance as a low murmur without distinct words. You watched their progress without really tracking it, your gaze resting on the movement itself, rather than on the destination. The carts would reach the gate before it closed for the night. There was no doubt about that, no tension in the waiting. They had made this journey many times, and the gatekeepers knew their faces. The birds were still active in this hour between day and night. A flock of starlings wheeled over the moat in a tight, liquid formation, their hundreds of tiny wings making a sound like a rush of wind through reeds. They rose and fell and twisted as a single body, their movements so perfectly synchronized that it was hard to believe each bird was making its own decision. Above them, higher and more solitary, a pair of gulls drifted inland from the sea, their white bodies catching the last gold of the sun. A few swallows darted in the air just beyond the wall, snatching insects that were invisible from your vantage point, their flight a series of quick, angular adjustments that seemed both frantic and effortless. You leaned your elbows on the warm stone of the battlement and followed the swallows with your eyes until they disappeared against the darkening mass of the ground. The watch officer arrived without making a sound, his soft leather boots absorbing the noise of his footsteps. He was an older man, a veteran whose face was a map of fine lines and whose hair was cropped short in the military style. He carried a small wax tablet in one hand and the stylus tucked behind his ear, though you had never seen him write anything during a watch. He stopped a few paces from you and looked out over the plain, not to inspect your work, but simply to share the view, and when he spoke his voice was low and unhurried. "The evening watch is the easiest," he said, a statement he made at the start of every shift, more a ritual than a piece of information. "The light will fade, the stars will come out, the moon will rise later, if it rises at all tonight. Keep your eyes moving, keep your ears open, and do not let the stillness fool you into sleeping. You can sleep when the sun comes back." You nodded, a small gesture that was more about acknowledgement than agreement, and he touched 2 fingers to his brow in a casual salute, before continuing his slow walk along the parapet to the next guard's position. You listened to his footsteps recede, a soft padding sound that grew fainter and fainter until it blended into the general quiet of the wall. Then you were alone again, or as alone as a guard on a city wall can ever be, with the whole of Constantinople at your back and the wide empty land before you. The light continued to change. The gold of the horizon deepened to copper, and the copper gave way to a dusky orange that seemed to set the whole western sky on a low, smouldering fire. The shadows of the towers stretched out over the plain, long fingers of darkness that pointed toward the distant hills, as if indicating something only the wall itself understood. The stone beneath your hands began to cool, releasing the stored heat of the day in a slow exhalation that you could feel as a subtle change in texture, a slight contraction that made the surface feel smoother and more settled. You traced a fingertip along the edge of a limestone block, following the chisel marks left by a mason who had been dead for 6 centuries. The marks were shallow and regular, a pattern of parallel grooves that still held faint traces of the ochre wash that had once colored the entire wall, a warm, earthy gold. Your thoughts drifted, as they always did during the first hour of a watch, over the small, unimportant details of your life. You thought about the meal you would eat when the watch was over, a bowl of lentil stew with a piece of flatbread perhaps, or some salted fish if the market vendor had had a good catch. You thought about the frayed edge of your left sandal strap, which you had been meaning to mend for a week, and would probably not mend for another. You thought about the sound of the water clock in the atrium of your lodging house, a steady drip that marked the hours with a patience you admired. None of these thoughts were urgent or demanding. They floated up and then dissolved, like bubbles rising through a glass of honey, leaving no trace behind. The sounds of the city began to arrange themselves into the familiar evening pattern. Behind you, somewhere in the neighborhood of the Blacerne, a woman was singing a lullaby to a child, her voice a thin, sweet thread of sound that wove through the narrow streets and climbed the wall like ivy. A dog barked once, twice, and then fell silent, its alarm apparently resolved. The distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer on iron rang out in a steady rhythm, 4 beats, then a pause, then 4 beats again, the kind of rhythm that could put a person to sleep if they let it. The harbor chain, that great iron boom that protected the entrance to the Golden Horn, was being lowered for the night. You knew the sound well, a heavy groan of metal on metal that traveled through the water and the stone, and came to you as a vibration in your breastbone rather than a noise in your ears. Closer, within the inner courtyard between the walls, The garrison was settling into its nighttime routine. You could hear the low murmur of voices from the guardhouse, the occasional clatter of a cup against a wooden table, the scrape of a stool being dragged across the flagstones. A lamp was lit in one of the lower windows, its flame a small orange point that flickered and steadied, flickered and steadied. You watched it for a while without thinking about why, your gaze drawn to the only source of artificial light in a world that was rapidly giving itself over to shadow. The first bats emerged from their roosts in the tower eaves, tiny dark shapes that fluttered erratically against the purple sky. They were so quick and so silent that you could only follow them for a second or two before they vanished, and then another would appear, and another, until the air above the wall was full of their soundless, chaotic dance. You had never understood how they could fly so close to the stone without ever colliding, how they could navigate a world without light with such perfect confidence. It was one of those small mysteries that you accepted without needing to solve, like the migration of the storks, or the way the tide in the Bosphorus sometimes ran north and sometimes south for no reason that anyone could explain. The stars began to show themselves. The first one appeared directly overhead, a single point of silver that seemed to wink into existence, as if someone had pricked a hole in the darkening fabric of the sky. It was soon joined by another, further to the east, and then another, and another, until the entire dome of heaven was dusted with light. You knew some of their names, the ones the old fishermen used for navigation, the wagon, the serpent, the crown, the goat. You did not study them. You simply let them be there, a quiet presence that asked nothing of you. Your body settled into the rhythm of the watch. You shifted your weight from one foot to the other, felt the familiar ache in your lower back that came from standing on stone, adjusted the grip of your spear so that it leaned at a slightly different angle. These small movements were unconscious, automatic, the body's way of maintaining comfort during a long stillness. You were not uncomfortable, not really. The ache was part of the watch, as much a part of it as the stone and the sky and the slow, steady passage of time. You had learned long ago that the trick to staying awake through the night was not to fight the stillness, but to accept it, to let yourself become part of it, a statue among statues on a wall that had seen 1,000 such watches. The evening light had faded almost entirely now. The fields below were a dark, undifferentiated mass, their colors absorbed into a single shade of deep blue-gray. The horizon was a thin, luminous line where the last embers of the sunset still smoldered, a seam between the earth and the sky that would soon float entirely. The ox carts had reached the gate and passed through. You had seen the flicker of the gatekeeper's lamp and heard the creak of the great wooden doors, and then the road was empty. The goater had driven his animals back up the slope and through a postern gate, and the moat was silent. Even the birds had gone to roost, leaving the air empty of everything except the cool, clean scent of approaching night. You remained at your post, a solitary figure silhouetted against the fading light, your cloak stirring gently in the breeze. The watch had begun, the long, quiet watch that would stretch from dusk until dawn, and there was nothing to do but wait and listen and be still. The city behind you was a vast, sleeping presence, its thousands of souls settling into their beds, its lamps being extinguished one by one, its streets emptying of all but the night patrols and the cats that prowled the alleys. And you were the eyes that watched over all of it, not with vigilance in the anxious sense, but with a calm, steady attention that was more like the attention of a shepherd watching over a flock that was already safe within the fold. The stone was cool now, and the night was beginning in earnest. You had been standing still for what felt like a long time, though the stars had only shifted by a hand's width above the dark line of the wall. The evening had fully given way to night, and the world on your side of the fortifications had settled into a deep, almost tangible quiet. Your body, which had grown accustomed to the weight of itself against the battlements, began to ask for movement, not out of restlessness, but out of a simple animal need to circulate warmth and to occupy the hours with something other than standing. You lifted your spear from where it leaned against the crenellation, felt the familiar balance of the ashwood shaft in your palm, and began to walk. The walkway was broad enough for 3 men to pass abreast, paved with large flagstones that had been laid in a staggered pattern like the scales of some immense, recumbent creature. Your footsteps made a soft, regular sound on the stone, a sound that was neither loud nor entirely silent, a low scuff that seemed to belong to the night itself. You had heard this sound on so many watches that you no longer consciously registered it. It was simply there, a quiet companion to your thoughts, a rhythm that marked time without urgency. To your left, the inner edge of the parapet dropped away into the shadowed space of the courtyard, where a few faint lamps still burned in the windows of the guardhouse. To your right, the outer crenellations rose in a sawtooth pattern, their merlons and embrasures alternating like the teeth of a comb, and beyond them lay the open darkness of the Thracian plain. As you walked, you let your free hand trail along the surface of the inner wall. This was a habit you had picked up years ago, when you were new to the watch and still learning the geography of the fortifications. The stone was cool now, the last of the day's heat long since radiated into the air, and its texture under your fingertips was a complex language of roughness and smoothness, of seams and edges and the occasional unexpected hollow. The limestone blocks were the dominant note, great rectangular masses of pale fossil fleckstone that had been quarried from the Marmara coast and hauled here by ox teams centuries before your grandparents were born. Each block was roughly a meter thick and half as tall, and they were fitted together with a precision that still, after all this time, left gaps no wider than a knife blade. You could feel the edges of those gaps as you moved your hand from one block to the next, a shallow, almost imperceptible channel where the mortar had weathered away to dust. The mortar itself was a story. You had heard old builders talk about it, how the Romans had mixed lime with volcanic ash and crushed brick to create a cement that hardened underwater and grew stronger with age. Here on the wall, exposed to rain and wind and frost for so many centuries, it had taken on a texture like pumice, a porous, gritty surface that crumbled slightly when you pressed a fingernail into it. In some places the mortar had been renewed, patched with a paler mixture that stood out against the original, like a scar on skin. You passed one such patch now, a broad area near the base of the next tower where the old mortar had failed entirely, and the masons of a later generation had repointed the joints with careful, respectful hands. The newer work was at least 200 years old itself, and it had already begun to weather into a harmony with the stone around it, the colours blending in the starlight until only the texture betrayed the repair. The brick courses were the next element to draw your attention, as they always did. The Theodosian builders had alternated bands of brick with the stone blocks, not only for strength, but for something like beauty, a visual rhythm that ran the entire length of the wall in a series of horizontal lines. There were typically 5 or 6 rows of brick between each course of stone, the bricks themselves a deep russet colour that looked almost black in the darkness, set in a bed of mortar that was thinner and finer than the mortar between the stones. You paused in your walk and let your fingers trace the neat parallel lines of a brick band, counting them silently, a small pointless ritual that you performed for no reason other than the satisfaction of the count. The bricks were flatter and wider than the ones used in houses, kiln-fired to a hardness that rang faintly when you tapped one with a knuckle. They had been laid in a running bond pattern, each brick overlapping the one below it by half its length, a pattern so regular that it felt like a form of music translated into clay and lime. Above the brick bands, the wall rose to the level of the walkway, where yet another material made its appearance, the crenellation itself, which was built not of solid blocks, but of a core of rubble and mortar faced with smaller, more irregular stones. This inner structure was normally invisible, hidden behind the dressed facing, but here and there the facing had fallen away, exposing the rough conglomerate beneath. You could see a section of it just ahead, a dark, jagged hollow, where a chunk of facing stone had detached during some long-forgotten winter storm. The exposed core was a jumble of river stones, broken tiles, and chunks of marble, all bound together by the same tenacious mortar that held the rest of the wall in its grip. It was not beautiful, this hidden anatomy, but it was honest, and you found yourself respecting it for its plain, unadorned function. You resumed your slow walk, and your mind turned outward, beyond the walkway, to the larger shape of the fortifications. The wall you stood upon was only the inner wall, the higher and thicker of the two main lines of defense. Between it and the outer wall, the space where you now walked was called the peribolos, a broad terrace that served as a staging ground and a buffer zone. The outer wall, lower and less massive, was visible to your right as a dark ridge against the slightly less dark sky, its own crenellations, a smaller echo of the ones beside you. Beyond that, you knew was the moat, though you could not see it from this angle. You could, however, picture it with perfect clarity, having walked its edge many times in daylight, a deep, wide trench lined with stone and divided into sections by transverse walls, its floor a tangle of dry grass and wildflowers and the occasional stunted fig tree that had found enough soil to root in the cracks. The moat was dry now, as it had been for generations, its original purpose as a water-filled obstacle long since abandoned in favor of the simpler, equally effective barrier of empty depth. You reached the first tower on your circuit, a massive square structure that projected outward from the wall and rose a full 2 stories above the walkway. The towers were spaced at regular intervals, roughly 60 paces apart, and each one was essentially a small fortress in its own right, with its own chamber, its own stair, its own store of arrows and oil and provisions. The door to this tower stood open, a dark rectangle in the paler stone, and you paused at the threshold, not to enter, but simply to look. The interior was black and quiet, smelling of old wood and cold ash and the faint animal musk of the bats that roosted in the upper chamber. You could just make out the first few steps of the spiral stair that led to the roof, each step a single wedge-shaped block of stone worn into a smooth concave depression by the passage of countless feet. The wear on those steps was a kind of calendar, a record of the centuries written not in ink, but in the slow erosion of limestone under leather and iron. You had climbed this stair once, on a winter afternoon when you had time to spare, and you remembered the way the narrow slit windows had let in slivers of pale light, the way your hand had fitted into the groove that others had worn into the central pillar. That memory surfaced now and then subsided, leaving only a quiet appreciation for the hands that had built such a thing. You continued past the tower, and your hand found the next block, the next seam, the next patch of weathered mortar. The wall was never exactly the same from one section to the next, despite the overall regularity of its design. The builders had used whatever stone was available, and so the blocks varied in color from a pale milky grey to a warm sandy buff, depending on the quarry and the depth of the cut. Some blocks were smooth, their faces dressed with a fine chisel that had left behind a faint, wavy pattern, like the ripples on a beach at low tide. Others were rougher, their surfaces pitted and irregular, as if the mason had decided that a particular block was good enough and moved on to the next. You noticed how the bands of brick were not always perfectly horizontal. Here and there they dipped slightly, following some subtle irregularity in the underlying stone, and these small deviations from the ideal gave the wall a living, organic quality, as if it had grown from the earth rather than been imposed upon it. About halfway along your circuit, you came to a block that you had noticed many times before, a block that was special, not for its size or its color, but for the marks that someone, long ago, had scratched into its surface. You stopped and leaned closer, your eyes adjusting to the dimness, and you traced the letters with your fingertip. The carving was shallow and uneven, made with a chisel or perhaps a nail, and it spelled out a name in Latin characters, Victor. Below the name was a simple cross, its arm slightly crooked, and below that what might have been a date, though the numerals were too worn to read with certainty. You had often wondered about Victor, whether he had been a mason proud of his work, a soldier stationed here during some forgotten campaign, or a pilgrim who had passed through the city and left his mark as a kind of prayer. You would never know, and the not knowing was not frustrating. It was simply another layer of the wall's existence, another small mystery that asked nothing of you. Your finger moved from the V to the I to the C, tracing each groove as if you were reading a text in a language you half understood. The stone around the carving was slightly smoother than the surrounding surface, polished by the touch of other hands over the years, a communal, unconscious act of preservation. Beyond Victor's block, the wall continued its patient journey toward the next tower, and your walk continued with it. Your footsteps had fallen into a steady rhythm now, a slow, measured pace that matched the beating of your heart and the rise and fall of your breath. The echo of those footsteps was a curious thing, a soft, delayed repetition that bounced off the outer wall and returned to you a fraction of a second later, slightly altered, slightly ghostly. It was not a loud echo, not the kind that you might hear in a canyon or a cathedral. It was a subtle, intimate echo, a private conversation between your feet and the stone. If you walked more slowly, the echo seemed to walk alongside you. If you stopped, it stopped a moment later, as if catching up. You experimented with this occasionally, varying your pace, to hear how the echo responded. But tonight, you simply let it be, a quiet presence at the edge of your awareness. The air had grown cooler, and you pulled your cloak a little more tightly around your shoulders. The stars overhead had wheeled further in their slow, imperceptible arc, and the moon, a thin crescent that had been invisible earlier, was now just beginning to show itself above the hills to the east. Its light was faint, barely enough to cast a shadow, but it did alter the appearance of the wall, picking out the edges of the blocks and the ridges of the brick bands in a soft, silver-grey illumination. Where before the wall had been a uniform darkness, it now became a landscape of subtle contrasts, a study in light and texture that shifted as the moon climbed and the shadows shortened. You could see the individual stones of the outer wall more clearly now, and the empty expanse of the moat beyond was a lighter band of grey, the dry grass within it catching the moonlight like frost. You passed the second tower, this one identical in plan to the first, but different in its details. Its door was closed. A heavy wooden slab banded with iron and a small lamp burned in a niche beside the door. Its flame, a steady, unwavering point of yellow. The lamp cast a warm circle of light on the stone floor and on the lower part of the door, and you could see the grain of the wood quite clearly, the way the planks had been fitted together with tongue and groove joints, the way the iron bands had been hammered into place by a smith whose name was also lost to time. The lamp's oil smelled faintly of fish, a common, cheap fuel that was used throughout the city, and its wick needed trimming. A thin ribbon of smoke rose from the flame and dissipated into the darkness above. You made a mental note to mention it to the lampkeeper in the morning, not as a criticism, just as a passing observation, and then you let the thought go. The worn steps that led up from the peribolos to the battlement walk appeared on your left. A short flight of perhaps a dozen steps, each one shaped like a shallow, elongated U from the wear of feet. The steps were made of the same limestone as the wall, but they were darker now, stained by centuries of rainwater and the oil from countless hands that had steadied themselves on the adjacent wall. You did not need to ascend them, your post was on this level, but you climbed them anyway because the rhythm of your walk had carried you there, and because there was a small pleasure in the change of elevation. At the top, you stood for a moment on the highest walkway, the one that ran directly behind the outer crenellations, and you looked out over the plain with a wider view than you had from below. The moon was higher now, and the fields were a patchwork of silver and shadow, the darker patches marking the stands of trees, the lighter ones the open ground. A faint mist was beginning to form along the course of the Lycus River, a low, pale ribbon that followed the water's path like a ghost. You watched it for a while, your mind empty of words, and then you descended the steps again, your hand sliding along the cool, worn stone of the side wall. Back on the lower walkway, you continued your circuit, completing the long, slow arc that would eventually return you to your original post. The wall beneath your feet was a constant, a bedrock of reliability, in a world where so much else was fleeting. Empires rose and fell, emperors were crowned and deposed, cities burned and were rebuilt, but the wall remained. It had stood through earthquakes and sieges, through the reign of Theodosius and the reign of every emperor since, through the slow conversion of the city from a Roman capital to something else, something still defining itself. The wall did not care about any of that. It simply existed, a fact of stone and brick and mortar, asking nothing, promising nothing, enduring everything. You came at last to the block where you had begun your walk, recognizing it by a small distinctive flaw in the stone, a vein of darker mineral that ran diagonally across its face like a scar. You stopped and placed your hand on it, feeling the cool, familiar roughness, and you realized that you had been walking for the better part of an hour. The night was still deep, the watch still long, but you felt no impatience, no desire for the hours to pass more quickly. The wall had given you its silence and its solidity, and you had given it your attention, and that exchange, small and wordless as it was, felt like enough. You returned to your post between the two square towers and set your spear against the stone again, its shaft settling into the familiar groove that years of use had worn into the mortar. Your walk along the parabolos had loosened your limbs and cleared your head of the small, idle thoughts that tended to gather during the first hour of stillness, leaving you with a quiet, open attention. The night was fully dark now, but the city behind you was not yet fully asleep, and you found yourself listening, not with any particular intent, but with the same patient, undirected awareness with which you had earlier traced the seams of the wall. Your ears, which had grown accustomed to the deep quiet of the countryside, now turned inward toward Constantinople itself, and the city spoke to you in a fading chorus of sounds that were familiar and distant and soon to be gone. The first sound that reached you, and the one that always seemed to mark the true beginning of the night, was the great harbour chain being lowered across the mouth of the Golden Horn. You could not see the chain from your position on the land walls, but you could hear it, a deep, sonorous groan that travelled through the water and the stone and the very bones of the city. The chain was an immense thing, each link as long as a man's arm and as thick as his wrist, forged from iron that had been smelted in the furnaces of the Black Sea coast and hauled here on barges centuries ago. It stretched from the Tower of Eugenius on one side of the inlet to a massive windlass house on the other, and every evening, as the last merchant ships made their way inside, the windlass crew would begin the slow, laborious process of paying out the chain until it hung just below the surface, an invisible barrier against any vessel that might try to enter without permission. The sound of this operation was not a single noise, but a sequence. First a low, grinding rumble as the great iron links began to move over the stone lip of the channel, then a rhythmic clanking as each link engaged the teeth of the windlass gear, then a long, reverberating moan that seemed to rise from the water itself and spread outward in concentric rings of vibration. You leaned on your spear and let the sound wash over you, feeling it as much as hearing it, a deep thrum in your chest that gradually faded into a series of smaller, fainter metallic clicks as the chain settled into its nighttime position. The whole process took perhaps 10 minutes, and when it was finished, a palpable stillness seemed to settle over the northern harbour, a quiet that was not silence but the absence of that particular, monumental noise. While the chain was still groaning its way into the depths, another set of sounds was reaching its conclusion much closer to your position. The Forum of Arcadius, which lay just inside the walls not far to the south, was home to a daily market that spilled out from the colonnaded square into the surrounding streets, a dense, noisy tangle of stalls and carts and shouting vendors. At this hour, long after the sun had set, the market was closing down, and the sounds of its dissolution drifted up to you in fragments. You could hear the wooden clatter of shutters being pulled down over shop fronts, a series of sharp, hollow reports that echoed off the stone facades and then stopped abruptly. The voices of the merchants, which during the day had been raised in competitive, overlapping cries, were now low and tired, exchanging the last words of the day about prices and deliveries and the weather expected tomorrow. You could not make out the individual words, only the rise and fall of the conversation, the way a question would be asked in a higher register and answered in a lower one, the way a joke would be followed by a short, breathy laugh that was swallowed almost immediately by the vastness of the evening. A cart was being loaded somewhere in the square, its wooden wheels grinding against the cobblestones with a gritty, irregular crunch, and the donkey brayed once, a long, mournful note that hung in the air for several seconds before fading into the general murmur. The shops were not the only enterprises winding down. In a paddock tucked between the inner wall and the first row of houses, a small flock of sheep had been kept for the night, probably a merchant's stock, that would be driven to the butcher's quarter in the morning. You could hear them clearly, the soft, anxious bleating of animals that were unsettled by the darkness and the unfamiliar enclosure. Their voices were high and tremulous, punctuated by the occasional stamp of a hoof on packed earth and the low, reassuring murmur of a shepherd who had bedded down beside them. The bleating came in waves, as if one sheep would begin and the others would follow, a brief, plaintive chorus that rose and fell and rose again, each iteration slightly quieter than the one before, as the flock gradually settled into sleep. Between the waves of sound, you could hear the shepherd humming, a tuneless, repetitive drone that seemed designed not to entertain but to soothe, a continuous low note that blended with the night air and the cool stone and the distant glimmer of the stars. Further away, perhaps a mile to the east, the neighborhood of the great palace was also giving up its daytime noises. The palace complex was a city within the city, a sprawling maze of halls and courtyards and gardens, and its routines were governed by a rhythm that was older and more formal than the rhythms of the market. From your post, you could sometimes hear the distant silver note of a buccina, a brass horn used to mark the changing of the guard at the palace gates. Tonight the horn sounded once, a single clear tone that cut through the darkness and then dissolved, leaving behind a faint metallic shimmer that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before it was absorbed by the stone and the silence. After the horn, there was a period of quiet, and then you heard something else, something so faint that you were not entirely sure you had heard it at all. The sound of chanting, a slow, measured melody sung by many voices in unison, drifting out from the palace chapel where the evening liturgy was being celebrated. The words were Greek, too distant to distinguish, but the cadence was familiar, a pattern of rising and falling phrases that was as much a part of the city as the walls themselves. The chanting continued for perhaps a quarter of an hour, a soft, sonorous undercurrent beneath the other, nearer sounds, and when it stopped, the silence that followed was deeper than before, as if a sustaining thread had been withdrawn from the fabric of the night. The sea, which lay to your left beyond the slope of the city, was a constant presence that you could hear when all the other sounds had died away, a soft, rhythmic lapping against the stone foundations of the sea walls. The water was calm tonight, and its voice was not the crashing of waves but a gentle continuous wash, a sound like a sleeper breathing, in and out, in and out. Each small wavelet rose and fell against the marble quays and the limestone buttresses, a faint liquid sigh that was so regular, so perfectly timed, that it became a kind of clock, a measure of the slow passage of the hours. The sea's sound was not loud. It was barely audible even in the quietest moments, a whisper at the very edge of perception, but it was always there, a baseline of calm beneath the more transient noises of the city. When the wind shifted slightly, as it did now, the salt scent of the water grew stronger, and with it the sound seemed to swell, a subtle increase in volume that lasted only a few breaths before receding again. Between the larger, more distinct sounds, there were countless smaller ones, the tiny auditory events that made up the texture of a city settling into sleep. A door closed somewhere in the neighborhood behind the wall, the soft, definitive thud of wood against wood. A woman called out a name, her voice high and clear, and a child's voice answered from further away, a brief, wordless cry that was more about acknowledgement than information. A dog barked, not in alarm but in a lazy, automatic way, its bark trailing off into a grumble as it circled and lay down again. Water dripped from a broken gutter into a stone basin, a single crystalline note that repeated at long, irregular intervals, each drop a tiny event that you found yourself waiting for without any sense of urgency. A night bird, some species you could not name, gave a low, fluting call from the cypress trees near the cistern, a sound that was repeated 3 times and then not again. As the hour deepened, these sounds began to thin out, not all at once but one by one, as if each was a candle being extinguished by a patient hand. The merchants' voices faded first, the last cart rumbling away into the maze of streets, the last shutter falling into place with a final, hollow clack. The sheep settled and fell silent, their bleating replaced by the deep, regular breathing of animals asleep. The shepherd's humming stopped, and in its place was only the occasional soft rustle of straw as a ewe shifted her weight. The harbour chain was already still, its massive links resting in the dark water, and the horn at the palace did not sound again. Even the chanting had ended, leaving behind an emptiness that seemed to open up in the air where the melody had been. The sea continued, but its sound seemed to grow softer as the night advanced, as if the water itself was sinking into a deeper, quieter rhythm. The dripping water slowed, the drops growing further and further apart until you realized with a small, distant surprise that you had not heard one for several minutes. The night bird did not call again. What remained, after all the individual sounds had faded, was a hush. It was not a silence, not an absence of sound, but a presence of its own, a vast, soft blanket of quiet that seemed to rise from the streets and the domes and the gardens and settle over the city like a layer of dust. The hush had its own texture, its own weight. You could feel it pressing gently against your ears, a fullness rather than an emptiness. It was made up of countless tiny, unidentifiable sounds that were too faint to be heard on their own, the collective breath of a city of 500,000 souls, the creak of cooling stone, the distant sigh of wind through 1,000 narrow alleys, the almost imperceptible hum of the earth itself. The hush was deeper than any quiet you had known in the countryside, because the countryside was never truly silent. There were always the insects, the wind in the grass, the rustle of leaves. But here, inside the walls of Constantinople, when the last lamp had been blown out and the last door had been barred, the quiet was a created thing, a product of so much human life compressed into stillness, and it was immense. You leaned on your spear and let the hush wash over you, not holding on to it or analyzing it, simply allowing it to be there. Your breathing had slowed to match the rhythm of the night, and your thoughts, which had earlier drifted over the small details of your life, had now become as still and as calm as the stone beneath your feet. You were not thinking about anything in particular, not the stew you would eat or the sandal strap you needed to mend. Those thoughts had dissolved into the hush like the distant horn and the merchants' voices. You were simply present, a pair of ears and a pair of eyes, and a quiet, steady attention that asked nothing of the world except that it continued to be still. The spear in your hand was a familiar weight, the wool of your cloak a familiar texture against your neck, and the moon, which had climbed higher while you listened, cast a pale light on the battlements that made the stone look like old silver. The city slept, and you listened to its sleep, a long, slow, uninterrupted quiet that stretched from the sea walls to the land walls, from the palace to the poorest quarter, from the great domes to the smallest courtyard. The hush would last for hours yet, until the first hint of dawn began to thin the darkness in the east, until the bakers lit their ovens and the fishermen pushed their boats into the water, until the city stirred and stretched and began its daily noise again. But that was a long way off, a distant future that had no claim on this moment. For now, there was only the hush and the stone and the slow, steady passage of the stars, and you, a guard on the wall, listening to nothing and everything, perfectly still. The transition from dusk to true night was not a single event, but a slow, layered process that unfolded over the better part of an hour, and you were perfectly positioned to witness it. The last embers of sunset had long since faded from the western horizon, leaving behind a sky that was no longer blue, but a deep, luminous indigo, a color that seemed to hold the memory of light even as it surrendered to darkness. Against this deepening backdrop, the city below you began to change, not in any dramatic fashion, but through a series of small, quiet illuminations that appeared one by one, like the first tentative notes of a melody that had not yet found its full voice. The first lamp you noticed was in a window directly below your position, perhaps 200 paces inside the wall, in a house whose upper story was just visible over the inner battlements. The window was a simple rectangle cut into the stone, its shutters still open to the cooling air, and inside it a hand moved, a dark shape against a darker interior, carrying a small clay lamp with a pinched spout and a looped handle. The hand set the lamp on the windowsill, and then a flame appeared, not with a sudden flare, but with a gentle wavering birth as the wick caught the oil and steadied into a small pear-shaped point of yellow light. The flame was so tiny at this distance that you could have covered it with your thumb, but its effect on the surrounding stone was immediate and tender. The rough surface of the window frame, the edges of the shutters, and the faint outline of the hand were all suddenly visible, bathed in a warm, flickering glow that seemed to push back against the advancing night. The lamp's light trembled slightly, not from any wind but from the natural instability of the flame itself, a small continuous dance that made the shadows around it shift and sway, as if they were breathing. You watched that single flame for a long moment, and as you watched, other lamps began to appear across the darkened cityscape, a scattered constellation of earthly stars that mirrored the ones that were just beginning to emerge overhead. To the south, in the crowded neighborhood around the Forum of the Ox, a cluster of 3 or 4 lights flickered into existence in close succession, their glow soft and diffuse through what must have been oiled parchment or thin linen curtains. Further east, toward the aqueduct, a single lamp appeared high up in what you guessed was a tower or a wealthy household's upper chamber, its light steady and unusually bright, suggesting a lamp with multiple wicks or a more refined grade of oil. To the north, near the Blackernay quarter, a whole row of windows lit up over the course of a few minutes, the lamps being set in place by hands you could not see, their collective glow casting a faint, warm aura that seemed to hover above the rooftops like a low-lying mist of light. The quantity of each lamp's illumination varied according to its distance and the nature of its fuel. The nearest lights burned with a clear golden radiance, their flames sharp and distinct, each one a tiny animated sculpture of heat and light. The farther ones were softer, reduced by the intervening air to a hazy amber smear that blended with the general darkness. A few lamps burned with a slightly reddish tint, suggesting that the oil had been pressed from olives of a particular variety or perhaps from sesame seeds, while others had a cooler, bluish edge that spoke of fish oil or some other marine source. The smells that reached you were faint and intermittent, carried on the occasional puff of breeze, a hint of olive oil, the waxy scent of burning beeswax from the richer households, and the pervasive, earthy smell of the lamp black that coated every stone surface near a long-used flame. These scents mingled with the salt air from the sea and the dry, dusty smell of the wall itself, creating a bouquet that was unique to this hour and this place. As the lamps multiplied, the shape of the city began to reveal itself in the darkness, not as a solid form, but as a pattern of scattered light points that traced the major streets and the contours of the hills. The Misai, the great central avenue that ran from the Golden Gate to the Augusteum, was visible as a long, irregular chain of lights that snaked through the darkness, its course marked by the oil lamps that hung outside the porticos of the wealthy, and the smaller, dimmer lights of the night travelers who still moved along its length. You could trace its path in your mind, from the gate where you had watched the ox carts enter, past the Forum of Arcadius, past the great column with its spiral reliefs, all the way to the distant glittering cluster of the palace district, where the lights burned in greater density and with a more permanent, institutional steadiness. The side streets were darker, their lamps fewer and more widely spaced, so that the city appeared as a branching tree of light, its trunk the Missae, its limbs the major cross streets, and its outermost twigs, the small unnamed alleys, where a single lamp in a single window was the only evidence of human presence. Your gaze lifted from the city to the sky, and you saw that the same process of illumination was underway there, though on a vastly larger scale, and with a different kind of light. The first stars had already appeared, the ones you had noticed earlier as pinpricks of silver in the fading blue, and now they were multiplying by the minute, filling the darkening dome of heaven with a steady, silent rain of light. The evening star, which was not a star at all but the planet Venus, hung low in the western sky like a drop of molten silver, so bright that it seemed almost to have a shape, a tiny, perfect disk of light that trembled slightly in the unsteady air. Above it, and spreading across the entire vault of the sky, the true stars were emerging in their ancient, predictable order, the brightest first and the dimmest last, a slow unveiling that had been going on since the beginning of the world and would continue long after you were gone. The stars were not scattered randomly, but arranged in patterns that you recognized without having to think about them. patterns that had been named and mapped by shepherds and sailors and astronomers across countless generations. Directly overhead, the great constellation of the Wagon, which some called the Bear, was wheeling slowly around the fixed point of the north, its 7 bright stars arranged in a shape that did indeed resemble a cart with a long, crooked handle. The 2 stars at the front edge of the wagon's bowl pointed, as they always did, toward the North Star, a steady, unwavering point of light that marked the axis around which the entire sky seemed to turn. You found the North Star easily, as you always did, and let your gaze rest on it for a moment, appreciating its constancy, its refusal to move while everything else circled around it. The wagon's position told you that it was still early in the night, perhaps the 3rd hour of darkness, and that the slow rotation of the sky had many hours yet to complete before dawn. To the east, rising above the dark hills of Asia Minor, the constellation of the Serpent was just beginning to clear the horizon, its long, winding chain of stars forming a shape that was more suggested than obvious, a delicate tracery of light that required imagination to see as a serpent, but that was beautiful regardless. Below it, the bright star that marked the heart of the Scorpion was a tiny orange-gold ember, its color distinctly warmer than the cold blue-white of the surrounding stars. The Scorpion itself would not be fully visible for another month or 2, but its heart was always one of the first of its stars to appear, a herald of the summer constellations that would dominate the southern sky in the months to come. You traced the outline of the serpent with your eyes, connecting the dots in the same way that your teachers had shown you when you were a child, and the familiar shape gave you a quiet sense of comfort, a reminder that the sky was not chaos but order, a vast, slow machine of light that could be read and understood. The Milky Way was becoming visible now, a faint, luminous band that stretched from the northeastern horizon to the southwest, a river of light so diffuse that it was more a texture than a shape, a subtle brightening of the darkness that revealed itself only when you looked at it indirectly. The philosophers said that it was made of countless stars too small and too distant to be seen individually, while the old myth said it was the spilt milk of a goddess or the path of souls ascending to the heavens. You did not concern yourself with the explanations. You simply looked at it, letting its soft, hazy glow fill your vision, a pale counterpoint to the sharp, distinct points of the individual stars. The Milky Way had no edges, no clear boundaries. It faded into the surrounding darkness so gradually that you could not say exactly where it ended, and this indeterminacy was part of its beauty, a quality of gentle, luminous mystery that no lamp on earth could replicate. Back on the ground, the lamps of the city continued to multiply, though the pace of new lights was slowing now as the last households settled in for the night. The pattern of illumination had shifted from the streets to the windows, and each lit window was a small glowing rectangle of domestic life, a frame that contained within it a world of quiet activity, a woman mending a tunic by the flickering light, a man reading aloud from a worn scroll, a child being tucked into a sleeping mat, an old person sitting alone with their thoughts, their face half lit and half shadowed by the lamp's glow. You could not see any of these details from your position on the wall, but you knew they were there because you had lived in those houses. You had been the child and the man and the reader, and the light of the lamp was the same light that had illuminated your own small room, the same warm, oily, slightly smoky glow that meant safety and rest and the end of the day's labor. The city was not an abstraction. It was a collection of such lights, each one a life, each life a story that was now pausing for the night, its pages turned down, its cover closed, waiting for the morning to resume. The moon, which had been a thin crescent when it first appeared, had now climbed well above the eastern hills and was shedding a pale silver light that altered the entire landscape. The moon's light was different from the light of the lamps or the stars, cooler and more directional, casting long, soft shadows that stretched across the parabolas in the outer wall. Under the moon, the stone of the battlements took on a bluish-grey tint, and the fields beyond the moat became a patchwork of silver and deep shadow, the stands of trees reduced to dark, indistinct masses, the open ground luminous and almost liquid in its pallor. The moon's crescent was sharp and fine, a slender arc of brilliant white with the rest of its disk just barely visible as a faint ghostly circle, lit by the earthshine that reflected from the planet below. You had always liked this face of the moon, The way it seemed both complete and incomplete, a promise of fullness that was still weeks away, a quiet, patient light that did not overwhelm the stars but shared the sky with them in a spirit of gentle cooperation. The interplay between the earthly lights and the celestial ones was a thing that you never tired of observing. The lamps of the city were warm and close and temporary, their flames flickering and guttering, their oil consumed and replenished, their existence dependent on human hands and human needs. The stars were cold and distant and eternal, their fires burning in the void for millions of years, utterly indifferent to the city and its inhabitants. And yet the two kinds of light existed together in this moment, each one visible to your eyes, each one a part of the same vast, silent spectacle. The lamps and the stars did not compete with each other, they complemented each other, the one illuminating the small, intimate world of human life, the other illuminating the infinite, inhuman vastness of the cosmos, and both were beautiful in ways that words could not capture. You stood there for a long time, your spear leaning against your shoulder, your cloak wrapped around you against the cool air, your eyes moving slowly between the city and the sky. The lamp in the nearest window was still burning, its flame steady now, and the wagon had turned another degree around the North Star, its motion imperceptible in the moment but undeniable over the course of an hour. The sea whispered against the distant quays, the hush of the city deepened, and the stars continued to emerge, fainter and fainter ones becoming visible as your eyes adjusted to the darkness, until the entire sky was a field of light so dense and so fine that it seemed almost like a solid thing, a dome of silver dust suspended above a sleeping world. You let your breath slow to match the stillness, and you did not count the hours, because the hours did not matter here, on the wall, under the lamps and the stars, in the long quiet middle of the night. The night had settled into its deepest rhythm now, a long, slow stretch of hours, during which the world seemed to hold its breath, and nothing moved except the stars and the quiet, regular operations of your own body. The watch was no longer a matter of alertness or anticipation. It had become a gentle, almost mechanical routine that you could perform without thinking, a series of small actions and observations that filled the time without demanding anything from your mind. You lifted your spear from its resting place, felt the smooth, familiar grain of the ashwood against your palm, and began the first of what would be many slow circuits along your assigned stretch of the parapet walk. Your pace was unhurried, each step measured and deliberate, your sandals making that same soft, scuffing sound on the stone that had been your companion since the evening began. Between the tower where you had stopped earlier and the next tower to the south, the distance was precisely 84 of your normal walking strides, a number you had established so long ago that you could no longer remember the first time you had counted it. You counted again now, not because the number had changed, or because there was any practical need to verify it, but simply because the counting itself was a kind of meditation, a quiet, rhythmic activity that occupied the surface of your mind while the deeper parts drifted elsewhere. 1. And the stone under your left foot was slightly rougher than the stone under your right, a patch of pitted limestone that held the cold differently. 2. And you passed the dark rectangle of a drainage channel cut into the inner edge of the walkway, a channel that carried rainwater down through the wall and out into the moat, now dry and silent. 3. And your hand brushed against the familiar seam between two blocks, the seam you had traced with your fingertip earlier in the evening, and would trace again many times before dawn. The numbers accumulated without urgency, each one a small, quiet marker of progress along a path that led nowhere in particular and back again. At 42 strides, exactly halfway between the towers, there was a slight dip in the walkway where the stones had settled unevenly over the centuries, creating a shallow depression that collected a thin film of dust and, after rain, a puddle that reflected the sky. Your foot found the dip automatically, your ankle adjusting to the change in elevation without any conscious instruction, a learned response that had become part of your body's memory. You paused there, as you often did, and looked out over the plain, though there was nothing new to see. The darkness beyond the moat was complete and featureless, the horizon lost in a haze of mist and starlight, the distant hills reduced to a faint, undulating line that was more a suggestion than a visible form. The pause was not for observation, but for the simple pleasure of standing still in the middle of a journey, a brief suspension of movement that made the subsequent steps feel fresher and more deliberate. After a few breaths, you resumed your walk, and the second half of the count began, 43, 44, 45, the numbers falling into place like drops of water from the broken gutter you had listened to earlier. At 84, you reached the base of the southern tower and turned, not sharply, but in a slow, easy arc that brought you back along the same path in the opposite direction. The walkway looked different when you walked north instead of south. Not because it had changed, but because the angle of your view had shifted, the towers swapping places, the pattern of the stone blocks reversing itself. This small change in perspective was enough to keep the circuit from feeling repetitive, a subtle variation that your mind registered without comment, accepting it as part of the natural rhythm of the watch. The moon, which had been on your right during the first leg, was now on your left, its light catching the edges of the crenellations in a different way, making the shadows fall in the opposite direction. The air felt slightly cooler on this return journey, a faint, freshening breeze that carried the promise of the early morning cold that was still hours away. You completed the circuit and returned to your post, where you leaned your spear against the familiar groove in the stone and turned your attention to the small oil lamp that burned in its niche beside the inner wall. The niche was a shallow, arched recess cut into the stone at chest height, its interior blackened by years of smoke, its lower surface worn smooth by the countless lamps that had rested there. Your lamp was a simple, unglazed clay vessel with a pinched spout and a looped handle, its body still warm from the flame, its oil reservoir about half full. You lifted it carefully, cupping your hand around the flame to shield it from the breeze, and examined the wick. The wick was a twisted strand of flax fibers, its tip glowing a dull orange and curling slightly inward, a sign that it had been burning for several hours and would soon need to be trimmed. You set the lamp back in its niche and took the small bronze tool that hung from a hook beside it, a simple pair of tweezers with flattened tips, designed for the single purpose of pinching away the charred portion of a lamp wick without extinguishing the flame. The task required a steady hand and a certain amount of patience. You reached into the niche, grasped the very tip of the wick with the tweezers, and pulled away the blackened, brittle end, dropping it onto the stone where it smouldered briefly and then went dark. The flame flared for a moment, brightened, and then settled into a steadier, cleaner burn, its light suddenly sharper and more yellow. You wiped the tweezers on the edge of your cloak and replaced them on their hook, satisfied with the small, complete act of maintenance that had occupied perhaps 2 minutes of your time. The lamp's oil would last until dawn, but you checked the level anyway, tilting the vessel slightly to see the dark, viscous liquid slosh gently against the inner wall. The oil was a thick green-gold substance pressed from olives grown on the terraced hillsides of the Aegean coast, its scent fruity and slightly bitter, a scent that reminded you of autumn harvests and the creak of olive presses. A small earthenware jug of reserve oil stood on the floor of the niche, corked and sealed with wax, ready for the rare occasion when a lamp burned dry before its time. You did not need it tonight. The lamp would last, and the ritual of checking the oil, like the counting of paces and the trimming of the wick, was simply part of the rhythm, a small, reassuring action that confirmed the world was still in order. With the lamp attended to, you allowed your gaze to drift along the walkway to the north, where another guard was stationed at the next tower, a man named Basil, who had been on the watch for even longer than you. Basil was older, heavier, and inclined to sleep during the quiet hours, a fact that the watch officer knew and tolerated because Basil's snore was a steady, reassuring presence that served as a kind of audible landmark for the other guards. You could hear it now, a low, rhythmic rumble that rose and fell with the regularity of a bellows, punctuated occasionally by a snuffling, grunting sound as Basil shifted in his sleep and resettled his bulk against the stone. The snore was not loud enough to be a disturbance. It was a soft, almost musical drone that blended with the other night sounds, the whisper of the sea and the creak of cooling stone, becoming just another thread in the fabric of the quiet. You listened to it for a while, not critically, simply letting it be there, a familiar human sound in the midst of the vast, impersonal stillness. The snore told you that you were not alone on the wall, that the watch was a shared endeavor even when each guard stood isolated at his post, and the knowledge was a small comfort, a reminder of the community of sleep-deprived men who kept the city safe through the long, dark hours. Your thoughts, freed from any immediate task, began to drift in the way that thoughts always drift during the middle of a night watch, moving from one small, unimportant subject to another with a dreamlike lack of urgency. You found yourself thinking about the stew you had eaten before coming on duty, a thick, brown mixture of lentils and onions and scraps of salted pork, simmered for hours in an iron pot until the lentils had dissolved into a creamy paste and the pork had fallen apart into tender shreds. The stew had been served with a piece of flatbread, rough and floury, torn from a larger loaf that the cook had pulled from the communal oven just as you arrived. You remembered the warmth of the bowl in your hands, the way the steam had risen into your face, the particular earthy flavor of the lentils mingled with the sharp bite of wild oregano. The memory was so vivid that you could almost taste it again, and your stomach gave a small, quiet murmur of acknowledgement. Not hunger exactly, just a recognition of past satisfaction. You thought about how the cook had ladled the stew from the pot with a long-handled wooden spoon, how the spoon had scraped against the bottom of the pot, how the cook had smiled without showing any teeth and told you to eat well because the night would be long. The memory faded as quickly as it had arisen, dissolving into the darkness like the smoke from a lamp, leaving behind only a faint, pleasant warmth. From the stew, your thoughts moved to the feel of wool against your neck, a sensation that you had been aware of all evening without consciously attending to it. The collar of your cloak was folded over against the night chill, and the coarse fibers brushed against the sensitive skin just below your jaw, creating a constant, low-level tactile presence that was neither comfortable nor uncomfortable, simply there. The wool was undyed, its natural color a warm grayish-brown that varied slightly from thread to thread, and it smelled faintly of the lanolin that remained in the fibers despite the carding and spinning and weaving. You reached up and adjusted the fold of the collar, tucking it more securely under your chin, and the movement caused the fabric to shift against your shoulders, redistributing its weight in a way that felt momentarily fresh and new. The cloak had been woven by a woman whose face you could still picture, a weaver in the commercial quarter who owned a large upright loom that clacked rhythmically all day long, a sound that you had heard many times when you walked past her workshop on your way to the market. She had sold you the cloak 3 winters ago, and it had since molded itself to the shape of your body, the shoulders stretched, the hem frayed, the inner surface worn smooth from constant contact with your tunic. The cloak was not just a garment, it was a record of all the watches you had stood, all the nights you had spent on this wall, and the feel of it against your skin was the feel of time itself, patient and accumulating. Your attention shifted to your feet, specifically to the left sandal, which had been bothering you in a minor, persistent way for several weeks. You lifted your foot and rested it on a low projection of stone, angling it so that the moonlight fell across the worn leather straps. The sandal was a simple military pattern, a thick sole of layered oxhide stitched to a network of straps that wrapped around your ankle and across your instep, secured by a bronze buckle that had long since lost its shine and taken on a dull greenish patina. The left sandal, the one you favored when you shifted your weight during long periods of standing, had worn down unevenly, the outer edge of the sole thinner than the inner edge, the heel compressed and slightly skewed. The strap that passed over your little toe had frayed to half its original width, and you could see the individual flax fibers separating from the twist, a slow unraveling that would eventually require a patch or a replacement. You made a mental note to visit the sandal maker in the leather workers' quarter, a man whose shop smelled of tannin and neat's foot oil, and who could resole a pair of sandals in the time it took to eat a meal. But you knew, even as you made the note, that you would probably not go. The sandal would hold together for a few more weeks, and then a few more, and the repair would become urgent only when a strap finally snapped, at which point you would finally do what you had been meaning to do all along. The thought was not a source of frustration. It was simply the way things were, the natural pace at which small problems moved through your life from the back of your mind to the front, and then, eventually, to resolution. You lowered your foot and resumed your position, your weight settling back onto both legs, your spine straightening, your shoulders relaxing. The night was at its deepest point now, the hour when even the most restless sleepers had succumbed to dreams, when the city was a single, silent mass of stone and flesh and breath. The lighthouse beam, which you could see from the highest point of the wall if you climbed a tower's stairs, was sweeping across the dark water of the Marmara in its long, steady rhythm, a pulse of light that appeared and disappeared and appeared and disappeared and appeared again, a silent metronome marking the passage of the hours. You did not need to see it to know it was there. You had seen it so many times that its cycle was imprinted on your mind, the slow brightening as the beam swung toward you, the brief brilliant moment when it pointed directly at the city, and then the gradual fading as it turned away toward the open sea. The lighthouse keeper would be awake, feeding the great oil lamp with fresh fuel, polishing the curved bronze mirrors that focused the light into a single, powerful shaft, performing his own quiet, solitary routine that mirrored your own. The thought connected you to him, a thread of shared wakefulness that stretched across the sleeping city. One man on the wall, another in a tower by the sea, both watching and waiting for the dawn. Time passed, though you could not have said how much. The stars wheeled overhead in their slow, majestic rotation, and the moon climbed higher, and your breath rose and fell in a steady, unconscious rhythm that was not so different from the rhythm of the sea, or the rhythm of the lighthouse beam, or the rhythm of Basil's distant, rumbling snore. You did not count the minutes. You simply existed within them, a quiet, watchful presence on the ancient wall, your mind empty of everything except the small sensory details of the present moment, the cool stone under your hand, the faint smell of lamp oil, the distant glitter of the Milky Way, the familiar ache in your left foot, the steady, reassuring beat of your own heart. The watch was long, but it was not heavy. It was a space of stillness that you had learned to inhabit completely, a space where time moved, not in hours but in breaths, each one a small, complete life of its own. Your gaze, which had been resting on the dark, familiar shapes of the battlements and the shadowed courtyard below, now lifted and drifted outward, beyond the outer wall and the moat, beyond the empty fields and the dark line of the distant hills, to the place where the land ended and the sea began. From your high perch on the land walls, the Sea of Marmara was not a single, uniform expanse, but a presence that revealed itself in pieces, a broad, shimmering darkness that filled the southern horizon and stretched away to the left, toward the narrow strait of the Bosphorus, and to the right, toward the narrow strait of the Dardanelles. The water was black at this hour, a deep, velvety black that was darker than the sky, but it was not an empty black. It was a black that held light within it, a black that moved and shifted and breathed, catching the pale silver of the moon and the faint scattered glitter of the stars in a way that made the surface seem almost alive. The moon, which had climbed to a good height by now, laid a broad, trembling path of light across the water, a path that began at the shoreline beneath the sea walls and stretched out toward the south, widening as it went, its edges soft and indistinct, its center a rippling liquid silver. The moonlight on the sea was not steady, but constantly in motion, broken into thousands of small, shifting facets by the gentle, invisible swell that rolled across the surface, each wavelet catching the light for a brief moment before passing it on to the next. The effect was that of a vast, silent field of tiny mirrors, all tilting and flashing in a slow, synchronized dance that had no beginning and no end. You could watch it for hours, and you had on many nights, letting your eyes follow the path of light as it stretched away toward the horizon, where the water met the sky in a line so subtle and so fine that it was hard to say exactly where one ended and the other began. The horizon was a seam of dark as darkest, a faint, barely perceptible boundary that separated the black of the sea from the black of the sky, marked only by the sudden absence of stars below a certain level. Where the moonlight did not fall, the water was a deep, featureless expanse, but here and there, small patches of reflected starlight glimmered like scattered diamonds on a bed of dark velvet. The stars that were bright enough to cast their own reflections did so as tiny, wavering points of light that appeared and disappeared with the movement of the water, never staying in one place, always trembling on the edge of visibility. The Milky Way, that great hazy river of light that spanned the sky, left a faint, diffuse glow on the surface of the sea, a pale, milky sheen that was more a suggestion than a visible form, a subtle brightening of the darkness that you could only see if you looked at it indirectly, with the corners of your eyes. The interplay of all these lights, the moon's broad path and the stars' scattered points in the Milky Way's soft wash, created a scene of quiet, ever-changing beauty, a scene that was never the same from one moment to the next, yet always recognizably itself. Into this expanse of dark and silver, the silhouettes of ships appeared from time to time, small dark shapes that moved slowly across the water or remained motionless, riding at anchor. Nearest to the shore, just beyond the entrance to the harbour of Theodosius, a fishing boat was making its way back toward the city, its latent sail, a dark triangular wing against the moonlit water. The sail was not filled with wind, but hung slack, the breeze being too light at this hour to provide much propulsion, and the boat was moving instead under the power of its oars, a pair of long, slender sweeps that rose and fell with a slow, rhythmic cadence. You could not see the oars themselves, only the faint silver splashes they made as they entered and left the water, each splash a brief bright disturbance in the moon's path that faded almost as soon as it appeared. The boat was a small, humble craft, its hull low and dark, its mast a thin, slightly curved pole, its deck cluttered with nets and baskets and the shadowy forms of 2 or 3 fishermen who had spent the night on the water and were now returning with the morning's catch. You watched its slow progress toward the harbour entrance, a progress that was so gradual that it was almost imperceptible, the boat seeming to hang in the same spot for long minutes before you noticed that it had moved a little closer, its silhouette now overlapping a different part of the seawall, its course angling gently toward the dark mouth of the harbour, where a single lamp burned on a stone pier. Further out, beyond the fishing boat, a larger vessel rode at anchor, a merchant galley of the kind that plied the coastal routes between Constantinople and the ports of the Aegean, carrying wine and oil and grain and cloth. The galley was a long, low shape, with a high curved stern and a single mast, its sail furled and its oars shipped, its hull dark and silent against the moonlit water. A single lamp burned at its stern, a small steady point of yellow light that was reflected in the water below it as a wavering golden column. The lamp was probably a navigation light, required by the harbourmaster's regulations, but it also served as a quiet signal of human presence, a small warm beacon that told anyone watching that the ship was not abandoned, but merely resting, its crew asleep on deck or in the small, cramped cabin beneath the stern platform. You imagined them, those unseen sailors, wrapped in their cloaks, their heads resting on coils of rope, their dreams filled with the memories of the day's rowing and the anticipation of the port they would reach tomorrow. The galley had likely come from somewhere in the Aegean, one of the islands perhaps, or the coast of Thrace, and it would unload its cargo in the morning and take on new goods for the return journey, a routine that had been repeated for centuries, season after season, year after year. The ship did not move, it simply floated there, a dark, patient shape on the dark, patient water, waiting for the dawn as you were waiting, each of you keeping your own kind of watch. Further still, near the mouth of the Bosphorus where the strait opened into the Sea of Marmara, you could just make out the ghostly shape of a sail, a single laden rig that was so far away it appeared as a tiny pale triangle against the darkness, moving slowly from left to right. The vessel beneath the sail was invisible, lost in the distance and the night haze, but the sail itself caught the moonlight in a way that made it glow faintly, a slim luminous blade cutting silently through the air. The sail's movement was so smooth and so steady that it seemed almost unreal, a dreamlike apparition that might vanish if you looked at it too directly. It was heading north toward the Black Sea, or perhaps it was coming from the Black Sea and heading south, its destination unknowable from this distance. You watched it for a while, tracking its slow, silent progress across the dark expanse, and then your attention drifted to the strait itself, the narrow channel that connected the Sea of Marmara to the great cold sea beyond. The Bosphorus was invisible as a body of water, indistinguishable from the surrounding darkness, but you could locate it by the lay of the land on either side, the dark, hilly mass of the Asian shore to the east, and the low, rolling heights of the European shore to the west. The two shores leaned toward each other there, narrowing the channel to less than a mile in some places, and the water between them was always in motion, a powerful current that flowed southward from the Black Sea, carrying with it the cold, fresh water of the northern rivers and the occasional piece of driftwood or floating ice. You could not see the current from your position, but you knew it was there, a constant, invisible river within a river, shaping the journeys of every ship that passed through the strait. The Asian shore, which lay directly opposite the city on the other side of the Bosphorus, was a dark, undulating line of hills that rose gently from the water's edge and faded into the night sky. During the day, those hills were a patchwork of olive groves and cypress trees and small, whitewashed villages. But at night they were reduced to a simple, two-dimensional silhouette, a shape of darkness against a slightly less dark background. A few tiny lights were visible there, scattered across the hills like earthbound stars, the lamps of houses and farms and small harbors where fishermen lived and worked. The lights were so distant and so faint that they seemed to flicker, though you knew the flickering was an illusion caused by the movement of the air and the limitations of your own eyes. One of those lights marked the village of Chrysopolis, a small port where the imperial couriers began their overland journeys to the eastern provinces, and another marked the Tower of the Leander, a lighthouse that guided ships through the treacherous currents of the strait. Beyond the hills, the land stretched away into the vast, mysterious interior of Asia Minor, a land of mountains and plateaus and ancient cities that you had never seen, and probably never would. Your thoughts drifted toward that unknown land, not with any particular desire to visit it, but with a quiet, detached curiosity about the people who lived there. The farmers and the shepherds and the village priests, all of them asleep now under the same stars that shone on you. The distance between you and them was immense, measured not only in miles but in the slow, patient pace of a world without engines or telegraphs, a world where news traveled at the speed of a walking horse and a journey to the interior took weeks or months. And yet the water connected you. The same sea that lapped against the walls of Constantinople also lapped against the shores of Asia, a continuous, unbroken body of water that encircled the known world and touched every coast, every harbor, every beach. The thought was not profound, it was simply a fact, a quiet, geological fact that you accepted without needing to examine it. The water itself was a presence that you felt as much as you saw, a vast, living thing that breathed in and out with the slow, regular rhythm of the tide. The tide in the Sea of Marmara was not large, only a matter of inches, but it was there, a gentle twice-daily rise and fall that pulled the water toward the shore and then released it again, a rhythm that was governed by the moon and the sun and the rotation of the earth, a rhythm that had been going on since long before the first human being ever looked at the sea and wondered what it was. From your position on the wall, you could not see the tide's effect on the shoreline, but you could hear it, a faint, rhythmic susurration that rose and fell with a slow, hypnotic regularity, the sound of small waves breaking against the stone quays and the marble sea walls, a sound that was so constant and so soothing that it had become a part of the city's very fabric, a sonic backdrop to every night, every sleep, every quiet moment of reflection. The sound was not loud, it was barely audible above the other, nearer sounds, but it was always there, a baseline of calm that underlay everything else, a reminder that the sea was patient, that it had all the time in the world. The breeze that had been freshening from the north brought with it the clean, sharp scent of the water, a scent that was part salt and part something else, something fresh and living, the smell of phytoplankton and seaweed, and the distant, cold cleanliness of the open sea. It was a scent that filled your lungs and cleared your head, a scent that spoke of vast distances and untraveled horizons, a scent that was at once invigorating and deeply calming. You breathed it in slowly, deliberately, letting it settle into your body, feeling the cool, moist air on your face and your hands, and you thought about the journey that the air had taken to reach you, blowing down from the north, across the Black Sea, through the winding channel of the Bosphorus, picking up the moisture and the salt and the faint green smell of the water as it came, a journey of hundreds of miles that ended here, on this wall, in this moment, in your lungs. The thought was not a complicated one. It was simply a recognition of the interconnectedness of all things, the way that the water and the air and the land were all part of a single, continuous system, a system that functioned without any need for human intervention, a system that would continue to function long after you and everyone you knew were gone. The stars reflected in the sea, the ships resting at anchor, the distant shore with its scattered lights, the slow breathing rhythm of the tide, all of it combined to create a sense of deep, abiding peace, a peace that was not the absence of disturbance, but the presence of something larger, something that contained all disturbances within itself and rendered them harmless. The water was a calm presence, endlessly patient, asking nothing of you, offering nothing but itself, and you found that you could rest your attention on it for as long as you liked, without growing tired or restless, the way you might rest your hand on a cool stone or your gaze on a still green forest. There was no urgency in the water, no hurry, no destination. It was simply there, moving and still, changing and constant, a mirror for the moon and a cradle for the ships and a path for the distant sail that was now disappearing into the night haze to the north. After a time, you shifted your weight and let your gaze return to the wall, to the stone and the mortar and the familiar, close-at-hand world of your duty. The watch continued, and the night continued, and the sea continued its slow, silent breathing beyond the dark line of the shore, a presence that you would return to many times before the dawn, a presence that was always there, waiting, patient and calm, like an old friend who never spoke but never left. The night had been growing quieter hour by hour, each phase of darkness stripping away another layer of sound, until what remained was not a collection of individual silences, but a single, unified stillness that seemed to have a texture and a weight of its own. You had been standing at your post for a long time now, long enough that the earlier parts of the watch felt like memories from another evening, and you had become aware, gradually and without any sense of alarm, that the world around you had entered its deepest phase of rest. The midnight hour, or whatever hour it was that marked the absolute bottom of the night, had arrived, and it brought with it a quality of quiet that was different in kind from the quiet that had come before. This was not the hush of a city settling down, not the fading of market sounds and the closing of shutters. This was a stillness so profound that it seemed to press gently against your ears, a stillness that transformed the familiar landscape of stone and sky into something strange and luminous and almost sacred. The dogs had stopped barking. You realized this with a small, distant part of your mind, the part that was always keeping track of the city's ambient noise, and the realization brought with it a sense of the completeness of the hour. Earlier, there had been dogs barking in the neighborhoods below the wall, a chorus of distant echoing voices that called to one another across the dark courtyards, and then fell silent one by one. The last of them, a deep-voiced hound somewhere near the cistern of a spa, had given a final half-hearted woof some time ago, and since then there had been nothing, not a growl, not a whimper, not the click of claws on stone. The dogs were asleep, curled in their corners and their doorways, their muzzles tucked under their tails, their dreams filled with the sense of the day's wandering. Without their sporadic, territorial voices, the night seemed larger and emptier, a vast acoustic space that held only the faintest traces of sound, the distant whisper of the sea, the soft sigh of the breeze through the crenellations, and the steady, almost subliminal hum of your own blood moving through your veins. The birds were silent too. Not even the night birds, the owls and the nightjars that sometimes called from the cypress groves and the overgrown gardens of the abandoned palaces were making a sound. The swallows that nested in the eaves of the towers were motionless, their small, sleek bodies tucked into the crevices of the stone, their rapid, chittering daytime voices completely absent. The gulls that drifted over the city during the day had long since settled on their perches along the sea walls, their heads drawn down into their shoulders, their bright, curious eyes closed. The absolute absence of birdsong was something you noticed not as a lack, but as a presence, a palpable emptiness that filled the air where the sounds should have been, a silence so complete that it seemed to hum with its own quiet energy. It was as if the entire avian population of the city had agreed, by some ancient, unspoken compact, to hold its collective breath during this deepest part of the night, to wait in perfect stillness for the first faint hint of dawn. The moon had climbed to its highest point, directly overhead now, a position it reached only once during each night's slow journey across the sky. At this zenith, the moon's light fell straight down on the city, casting shadows that were short and sharp and perfectly vertical, rather than the long slanting shadows of the earlier and later hours. The quality of the light was different too, a pale silvery grey that seemed to drain the colour from everything it touched, transforming the warm earthy tones of the limestone and brick into a monochrome palette of whites and greys and deep velvety blacks. The marble of the distant churches and palaces, which during the day glowed a warm honeyed gold, now appeared cold and ghostly, the surfaces smooth and luminous, like ice that had been carved into the shapes of domes and columns. The brick bands that ran through the wall in their neat, horizontal lines were no longer russet, but a dark charcoal grey, their texture flattened by the absence of warm light. The whole world had become a study in silver and shadow, a delicate, nuanced engraving rather than a painting, and you found yourself looking at familiar objects, the stone blocks, the iron lamphook, the shaft of your own spear, as if you were seeing them for the first time, their forms rendered strange and beautiful by the moon's cold, clarifying radiance. The shadows themselves were the most active things in this motionless landscape, though their movement was so slow and so subtle that it was almost imperceptible. The merlons of the outer crenellations cast a series of dark, rectangular shapes on the walkway, each one a precise geometric echo of the stone above it, and if you watched very carefully, over the course of many minutes, you could see that these shadows were shifting. The moon's motion across the sky, imperceptible in the moment, but undeniable over time, caused the shadows to slide across the flagstones with the patience of water wearing away rock. A movement so gradual that it felt less like change and more like a different kind of stillness. A stillness that was slowly rotating. The shadow of the nearest tower, a massive angular shape that fell across the courtyard below, had shortened and withdrawn since you first noticed it, its edge creeping back toward the base of the wall, retreating from the sleeping grass and the dark shapes of the supply carts. You watched the edge of that shadow for a while, not waiting for it to move, but simply observing it, and after a time you saw, or thought you saw, that it was no longer in exactly the same place, that it had shifted by the width of a finger, then another, its progress as silent and as unstoppable as the rotation of the earth itself. The coolness of the air was another quality of this midnight hour, a coolness that was different from the earlier chill of the evening. The evening chill had been a gradual, gentle descent, the slow release of the day's stored heat into the darkening sky, but this midnight coolness was something else, a settled, pervasive cold that rose from the ground and descended from the heavens and seemed to seep into everything equally. It was not an uncomfortable cold, not the kind that made you shiver or stamp your feet. It was a dry, still cold, a cold that felt clean and pure, as if the air had been washed by the moonlight and left to dry in the silence. You could feel it on your face, a faint numbing sensation on your cheeks and the tip of your nose, and you could feel it on your hands, which you had tucked into the folds of your cloak without consciously deciding to do so. The cold seemed to sharpen your senses, making the faint smells of the night more distinct, and you breathed in slowly, deliberately, tasting the air. The smells that reached you were delicate and layered, each one distinct yet blending with the others in a subtle, harmonious way. The most immediate smell was the cool, clean scent of the stone itself, a mineral, almost dusty smell that rose from the limestone blocks and the ancient mortar, a smell that spoke of deep time and patient endurance. Beneath that was the faint, resinous fragrance of cypress trees, a smell that drifted up from the gardens of the wealthy houses and the monastery courtyards, a dark green, slightly medicinal scent that was always strongest in the coldest hours of the night. The cypress trees were a common feature of the city's landscape, their tall, slender forms rising like dark flames against the sky, and their fragrance was a constant, quiet presence, a reminder of the living world that persisted even in the midst of so much stone. Mingled with the cypress was the salt scent of the sea, a clean, briny tang that the north breeze carried over the rooftops. And beneath that, almost too faint to detect, the earthy, slightly sour smell of the dry moat, of wild thyme and goat droppings, and the tough, resilient grasses that grew in the cracks of the revetment. The absolute absence of human sound was perhaps the most striking feature of this midnight stillness. The city, which during the day was a roaring, chaotic symphony of voices and hammers and cartwheels and church bells, had fallen into a silence so complete that it was hard to believe 500,000 people were sleeping within its walls. There were no voices, no footsteps, no creak of doors or clatter of pots, no distant chant from the monastery chapels or calls of the night watchmen on their rounds. Even the faint rhythmic snoring of Basil at the next tower had stopped, or had paused, or had become so soft that it no longer reached your ears. The silence was not merely the absence of sound, it was a positive thing, a substance that filled the air and pressed against your eardrums, a presence that seemed to hum with its own quiet, vibrant energy. In this silence, the smallest sounds became enormous. The rustle of your cloak as you shifted your weight, the soft, dry rasp of your own breathing, the faint high-pitched ring that existed inside your own ears, the sound of your own nervous system idling in the dark. Your body, which you had been inhabiting all night without giving it much thought, now came to the forefront of your awareness, and you noticed, with a kind of detached curiosity, that it felt both heavy and light at the same time. The heaviness was a deep, grounding sensation, a sense of being rooted to the stone beneath your feet, as if your body had grown denser and more solid during the long hours of the watch, as if your bones were made of the same limestone as the wall, and your flesh of the same patient mortar. Your feet pressed into the flagstones, and the flagstones pressed back, a slow, steady exchange of force that had been going on for so many hours that you had stopped feeling it as a separate thing. But now, in the stillness, you were aware of it again, the way the earth held you, the way gravity pulled you, downward with a gentle, irresistible persistence. At the same time, there was a lightness, a sense that your mind had become untethered from your body, that it was floating somewhere above you, a quiet, observing presence that watched your heavy, rooted body from a distance. The combination of these two sensations, the heavy body and the light mind, was not unpleasant. It was simply strange, a product of the hour and the stillness and the long, slow passage of the night. You looked down at your hands, which were resting on the shaft of your spear, and they seemed to belong to someone else, pale and still in the moonlight. The knuckles slightly swollen from the cold, the fine hairs on the back of the fingers catching the silver light and turning it into a faint, ghostly halo. The spear itself had become a familiar extension of your body, its ashwood shaft worn smooth by your grip, its iron head a dark, heavy shape that gleamed dully where the moonlight touched the edge of the blade. The spear was not a weapon tonight, it was a staff, a companion, a thing to lean on and hold on to, a vertical line that connected the stone below to the sky above. You felt the grain of the wood beneath your fingertips, the slight, regular ridges of the annual rings, each one a year in the life of a tree that had been felled somewhere in the forests of the north, and you thought about how the tree had stood in its own stillness, rooted to its own stillness, rooted to its own piece of earth, for decades before it became a spear, before it became a part of your watch, before it came to this wall and this night and this moment of perfect quiet. The battlements around you were like the walls of a sanctuary, enclosing you in a small private world that was cut off from the sleeping city and the dreaming plain. The molons rose like teeth against the star-filled sky, their edges crisp and sharp, their shadows falling in precise geometric patterns on the walkway. The embrasures between them were dark, vertical openings, through which you could see the dim, silver landscape beyond. And each one was a frame for a different piece of the night, a patch of starry sky, a section of the outer wall, a glimpse of the moonlit fields. You moved slowly from one embrasure to the next, looking through each one in turn, not searching for anything, simply observing the same view from slightly different angles, appreciating the way the composition shifted with each step. The world outside the wall was as still as the world inside. The fields empty, the road a pale, ghostly ribbon, the distant trees motionless and dark. There was no wind to stir the branches, no animals moving through the grass, no lights in the windows of the distant farmhouses. The whole plain was a single silent tableau, a painting rendered in shades of grey and silver, waiting for the first light of dawn to bring it back to life. Time itself seemed to have changed its nature during this midnight hour. It no longer flowed in a steady, measurable stream, but had become viscous and slow, a thick, honey-like substance that moved only with great effort, each second stretching out into a small eternity. You had no way of knowing how long you had been standing there, and you did not particularly want to know. The knowing would have broken the spell, would have reintroduced the world of clocks and bells and scheduled duties into this timeless space. You were content to let time pass without measuring it, to exist in the long, slow now of the night's deepest point, a now that had no beginning and no end, that simply was, like the stone and the moon and the silent, sleeping city. The stillness was so complete that it became almost audible, a low, continuous hum that filled the air and vibrated in your bones, a sound that was not a sound but the feeling of absolute quiet pressing against your ears. It was the kind of stillness that made you hold your own breath without meaning to, that made you move with exaggerated slowness so as not to disturb it, as if the entire world was a single sleeping creature that might wake at the slightest noise. You stood motionless in the center of this vast, silent embrace, and you felt the wall beneath you, ancient and solid, and the moon above you, cold and clear, and the stars beyond, infinite and patient, and you were a part of all of it, a small, quiet point of awareness in the middle of the great, sleeping night. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do, nothing to think about, nothing to become. There was only the stillness and the stone, and the slow, steady rhythm of your own heart, beating softly in the silence, like a distant, muffled drum. You had been facing the plain for most of the night, your gaze resting on the dark fields and the distant hills and the shimmering path of the moon on the water. But now, as the midnight stillness deepened and the hours accumulated behind you like a slow, quiet weight, you felt a gentle impulse to turn around. The movement was unhurried, a slow pivoting of your body that began with your feet shifting on the worn flankstones and travelled up through your legs and your hips and your shoulders, until you were no longer looking outward at the Thracian countryside, but inward, at the vast, sleeping metropolis that sprawled behind the inner wall. Your cloak swung softly with the motion, its hem brushing against the stone, and your spear, which you had been holding loosely in your right hand, now rested against your shoulder at a new angle, its familiar weight settling into a slightly different position. The transition was complete, and the city lay before you, a dark, silent, and impossibly dense landscape of stone and shadow and faint, scattered light. The first thing that your eyes found, because it was impossible not to find it, was the great dome of Hagia Sophia, rising above the intervening rooftops and the inner wall like a second, more perfect hill that had been placed among the natural ones. The dome was not a shape so much as a presence, a vast, curving darkness that blotted out a portion of the starry sky, its outline smooth and symmetrical and almost impossibly large. The moonlight fell on its upper curve, the part that faced the south, and turned the lead sheeting into a pale silvery grey that seemed to glow faintly against the deeper black of the surrounding sky. The lower part of the dome, the part that sloped away toward the north, was in shadow, a dark, velvety mass that merged with the rest of the building and the dark tangle of streets below. The dome did not look like something that had been built by human hands. It looked like a natural feature of the landscape, a broad, gentle mountain that had been shaped by wind and time into a perfect hemisphere, and its presence was so calm and so commanding that your gaze kept returning to it, no matter where else you looked. Around the main dome, the smaller half-domes cascaded downward in a series of descending curves, each one a stepping stone of shadow and moonlight, and from their edges rose the dark, slender shapes of minarets and buttresses, their details lost in the darkness, but their overall forms clear and distinct against the stars. Beneath the dome and spreading out in every direction was the city itself, a dense, intricate maze of streets and buildings that covered the 7 hills like a rumpled blanket. From your elevated position on the land walls, the city appeared as a single continuous texture of dark rectangles and irregular open spaces, punctuated by the occasional taller structure, a church dome, a column, a palace wing that rose above the general roofline. The moonlight was bright enough to reveal the larger features of this urban landscape, the broad, straight avenues and the dark, winding alleys, the open squares and the crowded residential blocks. But it was not bright enough to reveal any details, any individual windows or doorways or carved cornices. Everything was reduced to masses and voids, to light and shadow, to a vast, silent map of human habitation frozen in its sleeping state. Your eyes followed the course of the Mese, the main thoroughfare that cut through the heart of the city like a straight, deliberate incision from the Golden Gate all the way to the Augusteum. The Mese was visible not as a continuous line, but as a string of faint, widely spaced lights, the oil lamps that had been left burning outside the porticos of the wealthy and the public buildings. These lamps were fewer now than they had been earlier in the night, some of them having burned through their oil and extinguished themselves, but enough remained to trace the avenue's path with reasonable clarity. You could see it starting from the Forum just inside the Golden Gate, a small cluster of lights that marked the beginning of the main road, then moving in a straight, slightly angled line toward the northeast, passing through the Forum of Arcadius and the Forum of the Ox, each of which appeared as a slightly brighter, slightly more open patch of light and shadow. The maze then divided, or would divide, around the great column of Constantine, though from your angle you could not see the fork itself, only the general brightening of the city centre, where the imperial forums and the great palace complex concentrated their collective wealth of marble and lamp oil. The forums themselves were visible as dark, open spaces in the otherwise dense fabric of the city, voids where the moonlight fell on empty flagstones and silent fountains and the dark, columned facades of the surrounding porticos. The Forum of Theodosius, which lay roughly due east of your position, was a broad, rectangular plaza that you could just make out by the way the surrounding buildings fell away on either side, leaving a gap of lighter darkness that was the open sky above the square. In the center of that gap, a single, slender column rose against the stars, the column of Theodosius with its spiral reliefs and its bronze statue of the emperor on top, a statue that was now just a dark, human-shaped silhouette against the Milky Way. The Forum was empty, its merchants long gone, its shoppers asleep, its marble pavements cold and bare, and the silence that rose from it was the silence of a place that was accustomed to noise but had temporarily surrendered to the universal quiet of the night. Beyond the Forums, the Palace district occupied the easternmost tip of the peninsula, a sprawling complex of buildings and gardens and courtyards that covered acres of ground and descended in terraces toward the sea. From your position, the palace was largely hidden by the intervening hills and the bulk of Hagia Sophia, but you could see the uppermost terraces, a series of flat, dark platforms that stepped down toward the invisible shoreline, and the faint, scattered lights of the guards and the night servants who kept the vast machinery of the imperial household running even during the hours of darkness. A few of the palace windows were lit, their glow dim and yellow behind what were probably silk curtains or oiled parchment screens, and these lights were like distant stars that had fallen to earth, tiny, warm points of radiance in the midst of the dark, sleeping mass of the city. The palace was not a single building, but a city within a city, and its many roofs and domes and towers created a complex, jagged silhouette against the eastern sky, a silhouette that was already beginning to soften as the first faint hint of the approaching dawn gathered somewhere beyond the hills of Asia. The 7 hills of Constantinople, the ancient, worn-down summits that the city's founders had chosen as the site of their new capital, were not always easy to distinguish from one another, but on a clear night like this, with the moonlight casting long, soft shadows, you could trace their contours by the way the streets flowed around them. The hills were not tall, none of them rising more than a few hundred feet above the sea, but they were steep enough to shape the city's layout, forcing the main avenues to follow the valleys and the ridges, creating a series of natural amphitheatres where the houses climbed up the slopes in terraced rows. The nearest hill, the one that rose just inside the walls near your position, was the Hill of the Black Henna, a broad, gentle rise that was crowned by the Church of the Virgin and the imperial palace that had been built onto the walls themselves. The hill was dark now, its terraces and stairways invisible, but you knew its shape intimately, having walked its streets many times, and you could imagine the sleeping houses that clung to its slopes, their rooftops overlapping like the scales of a fish, their inhabitants breathing softly in the dark. Between the hills, the valleys were filling with a thin, pale mist that gathered in the low places and spread outward like a slow, silent tide. The mist was not thick, not the dense, obscuring fog that sometimes rolled in from the sea during the winter months, but a light, ethereal haze that softened the edges of the buildings and blurred the already faint lights into a gentle, diffuse glow. It was most visible in the valley of the Lycus, the shallow depression that ran through the middle of the city from the land walls to the sea, where the stream that gave the district its name trickled through a stone channel beneath the streets. The mist there was a pale silver-white ribbon that caught the moonlight and seemed almost to glow from within, a ghostly river of vapour that flowed silently between the dark banks of the sleeping houses. Elsewhere, the mist pooled in the open spaces of the forums and the market squares, lying close to the ground like a shallow, motionless lake, its surface perfectly smooth and unrippled by any breeze. The mist was a quiet, patient presence, a thing that came in the deepest hours of the night and faded with the first warmth of the sun, and it gave the city an air of soft, dreamlike unreality, as if the whole metropolis had been wrapped in a layer of cotton and set aside to rest. The population of Constantinople, those 500,000 souls who filled the houses and the tenements and the monasteries and the palaces, were all asleep now, every last one of them, or nearly so. You imagined them, not as individuals with names and faces and histories, but as a single, vast, collective presence, a great, slow breathing that rose and fell in unison, a rhythm that was too deep and too slow to be heard, but that you could feel, somehow, in the stillness of the air. The breathing of the city was a comforting thought, a reminder that you were not alone on your wall, that the darkness was filled with life, that every house and every room and every bed held a sleeper who trusted the walls and the guards and the quiet order of the night to keep them safe until morning. The mist that gathered in the valleys seemed to be the visible expression of that collective breath, the warm, moist exhalation of so many sleeping bodies condensing in the cool night air, rising from the streets and the courtyards and drifting slowly toward the sea. It was a gentle, almost tender image, the idea that the city breathed, that it was alive, that its sleep was not a suspension of life, but a different form of it, a slow, deep, restorative phase of the great cycle that turned day into night and night into day. You could trace the course of other major streets by the faint glimmers of light that marked their lengths, the lamps that had been set out for the benefit of the night patrols, and the occasional traveller who had legitimate business after dark. The street that led from the Forum of Constantine to the Church of the Holy Apostles was a thin, intermittent chain of yellow points, each lamp a small, solitary beacon in the vast darkness. The street that curved around the base of the third hill, past the great open-air cistern and the vegetable market, was darker, its lamps fewer and farther between, but you could still make out its general direction by the way the darkness seemed slightly less absolute along its path. The harbour districts, the commercial quarters that lined the Golden Horn, were almost completely dark, their wharves and warehouses silent, their cranes motionless, their ships tied up, and their cargoes unloaded. A single lamp burned at the entrance to the Neorian harbour, a small, steady flame that marked the place where the harbour master's office stood. But beyond that, the long curve of the Golden Horn was a dark, empty expanse, its waters indistinguishable from the land. Nothing stirred anywhere in the great city. No carts rumbled through the streets, no doors opened or closed, no voices called out in the darkness. The forums were empty, their colonnades silent, their statues standing motionless on their pedestals, their bronze and marble faces turned toward the darkness with expressions that were impossible to read. The palaces were still, their courtyards deserted, their guards standing at their posts with the same quiet patience that you yourself possessed. The churches were dark, their mosaics invisible, their icons shrouded in shadow, their candles extinguished until the morning liturgy. The Hippodrome, that vast elongated arena where the crowds gathered on race days to cheer the blues and the greens, was an empty bowl of darkness, its seething tiers rising in silent, concentric rings, its central spine a long dark line of obelisks and columns, and the famous serpent column that had been brought from Delphi centuries ago. You could see the Hippodrome as a dark, open space just to the south of Hagia Sophia, its outline clearly defined by the surrounding buildings, and the silence that came from it was the silence of a place that was accustomed to roaring crowds and was now taking its rest. You were simply a pair of eyes, watching over this city at rest. The thought came to you not as a realization, but as a quiet, obvious fact, a simple statement of your purpose and your position. You were not a hero, not a warrior, not a figure of importance in the grand scheme of the empire. You were a guard on a wall, a man with a spear and a cloak, standing in the darkness and looking at a sleeping city. And yet, in this moment, you were also something more, something essential. You were the attention that kept the city safe, the wakefulness that balanced the city's sleep, the single point of awareness that stood between the darkness outside the walls and the peace within. The weight of that responsibility was not heavy. It was light, almost weightless, a natural extension of your presence here on the wall, as natural as the stone beneath your feet and the stars above your head. You did not feel important. You did not feel proud. You simply felt present. Fully and completely present, your eyes moving slowly over the rooftops and the domes and the dark, misty valleys, your breath rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm that matched the breathing of the city itself. The night continued, deep and silent and seemingly endless, and you remained where you were, facing inward, your back to the plain, your gaze resting on the great dark shape of the dome and the scattered fading lights of the Mysae and the soft silver mist that pooled in the valleys between the hills. The city slept, and you watched, and the hours passed without hurry or concern. A quiet, companionable stillness that required nothing of you except that you continued to be there, a pair of eyes in the darkness, a presence on the wall, a part of the night and the city and the vast, slow-turning wheel of the stars. The night had been deep and still for what felt like a very long time, a single, unbroken expanse of darkness that seemed to have no beginning and no end. But now, as you stood at your post with your back to the sleeping city and your eyes turned once again toward the plain, you became aware of a change. The change was not dramatic, not the kind of thing that announced itself with a sound or a sudden shift. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, a quality of the darkness itself that was beginning to alter in a way that you felt before you could name it. The east, which for hours had been indistinguishable from the rest of the sky, a seamless continuation of the deep velvety black that covered the world, was now a little less black than it had been, a little thinner, as if some unseen hand had begun to draw away a single layer of the night's many veils. The difference was so slight that you might have dismissed it as a trick of your tired eyes, but it persisted, and as you watched, it grew, a slow, steady lightening of the darkness that was not yet light, not yet color, only a gradual dilution of the deep, absolute black into something slightly paler, something that hinted at the possibility of a morning still far away. The stars, which had been your silent companions through all the long hours of the watch, were the first to respond to this subtle shift in the eastern sky. They did not disappear all at once, nor did they fade in any dramatic fashion. They simply began, one by one, to withdraw from the edges of the sky, starting with the smallest and the faintest. The tiny dim stars that had been visible only when you looked at them indirectly, the ones that populated the spaces between the brighter constellations like a fine scattered dust, were the first to go, their pale points of light dissolving into the slowly brightening background of the sky as if they had never been there at all. You watched a small cluster of these faint stars, a group that you had been absently tracking for the past hour, and you saw that one of them was now gone, and then another, their absence creating small empty patches in the familiar pattern of the heavens. The brighter stars held on longer, their light still sharp and distinct against the dark blue of the upper sky, but even they seemed to have lost some of their earlier brilliance, their diamond-hard sparkle softened by the faint, milky pallor that was now spreading upward from the horizon. The wagon, which had wheeled through the night and now hung low in the northwestern sky, was still clearly visible, its 7 stars burning steadily, but the dimmer stars that trailed behind it, the ones that formed the handle's faint extension, were becoming harder to see, their light struggling against the gradual brightening of the background. The Milky Way, that great, hazy river of starlight that had stretched across the sky from horizon to horizon, was also fading, its diffuse glow dissolving into the general pallor of the pre-dawn atmosphere. The soft, luminous band that had been so beautiful during the deep night was now barely visible, a faint, ghostly suggestion of light that you could only see if you knew exactly where to look, a memory of radiance rather than radiance itself. The sky was transforming from a field of sharp, distinct points into a smoother, more uniform expanse, its texture changing from granular to silky, its color shifting from deep indigo to a softer, more muted shade that was neither blue nor gray, but something in between, a quiet, transitional hue that had no name but that spoke of the approaching day. The darkness on the ground was also beginning to thin, though more slowly than the darkness in the sky. The plain before you, which had been a single, undifferentiated mass of deep shadow for so many hours, was now starting to reveal its larger features, the broad, open spaces and the darker masses of the tree stands and the low, rolling contours of the land. The horizon, which had been invisible, a seamless join between the black earth and the black sky, was now becoming a distinct line, a thin, dark seam that separated the land from the heavens. The line was faint at first, barely perceptible, a suggestion of division rather than a clear boundary, but as the minutes passed and the light continued to grow, it became sharper, more definite, a dark horizontal stroke that ran across the entire eastern edge of the world. Below that line, the earth was a deep, velvety gray. Above it, the sky was a slightly lighter gray, and the contrast between the two was the first real indication that the night was beginning to end. The air, which had been steadily cooling throughout the night, now reached its coldest point, a particular chill that always came in the hour before dawn. It was a dry, still cold, different from the coolness of the evening and the deep, settled cold of midnight. It was a cold that seemed to rise from the ground and seep into your bones, a cold that made the stone of the wall feel like ice beneath your hand, and turned your breath into a faint, visible mist that hung in the air for a moment before dispersing. You drew your cloak a little tighter around your shoulders, tucking the rough wool more closely under your chin, and the familiar weight of the fabric was a comfort, a small, warm barrier against the pre-dawn chill. The cold was not unpleasant, it was invigorating, a sharp, clean sensation that cleared the last of the night's drowsiness from your mind and made you feel more awake, more present, more aware of the world that was slowly, quietly preparing to greet the sun. The cold seemed to sharpen every edge, to clarify every outline, to make the emerging shapes of the landscape more distinct and more real, as if the chill itself was a kind of light that illuminated the world in a different spectrum. Your ears, which had grown accustomed to the deep, almost perfect silence of the midnight hour, now detected a small tentative sound, a sound that was so faint and so brief that you were not entirely sure you had heard it at all. It came from somewhere inside the wall, from a fig tree that grew in a sheltered corner of the courtyard between the towers, its roots wedged deep into the cracks of the stone, its branches spreading out in a dark, tangled canopy. The sound was a single tentative note, a brief, liquid chirp that rose into the still air and then stopped abruptly, as if the bird that had made it was not yet fully awake, had tried a note in its sleep and then fallen silent again. You listened, your breath held, your head tilted slightly toward the source of the sound, and after a long pause, the note came again, a little stronger this time, a little more confident, a small, bright thread of sound that seemed to hang in the cold air like a single drop of water. It was the voice of a blackbird, or perhaps a thrush, one of the early singers that always began the morning chorus before any of the other birds, and its solitary, tentative call was a quiet announcement that the night was passing, that the long stillness was coming to an end, that the world was beginning, very slowly, to wake up. The bird's note was soon joined by another, a second blackbird somewhere further along the wall, its voice a slightly different pitch, a slightly different rhythm, and the two birds began a slow, irregular duet, each one singing a few notes and then pausing, the silence between their calls filled with the soft, expectant hush of the approaching dawn. Their song was not the full-throated, exuberant chorus that would come later when the sun was up and the day was fully alive. It was a quiet, cautious prelude, a testing of the silence, a gentle exploration of the boundary between night and day. The notes were clear and pure, each one a small, perfect sphere of sound that rose into the cold air and faded slowly, leaving behind a faint, shimmering resonance that seemed to linger in your ears long after the sound itself had stopped. You listened to the birds with a quiet, undirected pleasure, letting their song wash over you, a delicate, intermittent melody that was the first music of the new day. The light in the east continued to grow slowly and steadily, and as it grew, the world around you began to take on form and substance. The outline of the nearest cypress tree, a tall, slender shape that stood just inside the outer wall, was the first distinct thing to emerge from the general darkness, its dark, vertical silhouette becoming visible against the slowly brightening sky. The cypress was a familiar landmark, a tree you had seen 1,000 times, but in this pre-dawn light it looked different, its shape more sharply defined, its branches more clearly articulated, its texture almost tangible even from a distance. The tree seemed to be drawing itself out of the darkness, assembling its form piece by piece as the light increased, and you watched it with a quiet fascination, appreciating the way the simple, elegant shape of the cypress could be so beautiful, so complete, so perfectly itself. Beyond the cypress, the shape of the next tower along the wall was also becoming visible, its square, solid mass emerging from the gloom like a ship appearing out of a fog, its edges crisp and clean, its crenellations a dark serrated line against the paling sky. The tower had been there all along, of course, only a few dozen paces from your position, but the darkness had swallowed it, had made it invisible, and now the returning light was giving it back to you, a quiet, reassuring presence that anchored the landscape and made the world feel solid and real again. The outer wall and the moat were the next features to emerge, their long parallel lines stretching away to the north and south in a graceful sweeping curve. The moat, which had been a dark, featureless trench for most of the night, was now a broad, shallow valley of grey-green shadow, its floor a tangle of dry grass and wild thyme that was just beginning to catch the first faint light on its dew-soaked leaves. The outer retaining wall, a lower, rougher structure than the main fortifications, was a dark, horizontal band that marked the far edge of the moat. And beyond it, the open fields were taking on a soft, silvery sheen as the light touched the frost that had formed on the grass during the coldest hours of the night. The fields stretched away toward the horizon in a series of gentle, undulating waves, their contours now visible as subtle variations in the grey light, the low rises catching the brightness, the shallow dips remaining in shadow. The landscape was still colourless, still rendered in shades of grey and silver and charcoal, but it was no longer the flat, two-dimensional darkness of the deep night. It had depth and texture and distance, a sense of space that had been missing for hours. The horizon itself, which had been the first sign of the coming dawn, was now the brightest part of the entire landscape, a long, thin strip of pale, luminous grey that was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to warm with the faintest hint of colour. The colour was not yet a true colour, not the gold or rose or orange that would come later. It was a suggestion of colour, a barely perceptible shift from cool grey to a slightly warmer tone, a hint of ochre or amber that was so subtle it was more like a mood than a visual fact. The band of light along the horizon was widening, spreading upward and outward, pushing back the darkness in a slow, patient advance that had been going on for billions of years, long before the first human being stood on a wall and watched it, and would continue for billions of years after every wall had crumbled to dust. You watched the slow expansion of the light with a quiet, wordless appreciation, feeling yourself to be a small part of a vast, ancient rhythm. A rhythm that was larger than the city, larger than the empire, larger than any human concern. The stars that had been so bright in the western sky were now fading rapidly, their light swallowed by the advancing dawn. One by one, they winked out, the faintest first and then the brighter ones, until only a few of the very brightest remained, stubborn points of silver that clung to the pale sky like the last leaves on a winter tree. The wagon was almost gone, only the two brightest stars of its bowl still visible, and the serpent had vanished entirely. Its long, winding chain of light dissolved into the pale grey of the morning. The moon, which had been such a constant, luminous presence throughout the night, was now a thin, ghostly crescent, low in the western sky, its light pale and watery, its shape barely distinct against the brightening background. The moon seemed tired, as if it had been awake all night too, and was now ready to follow the stars into the quiet oblivion of the day-lit sky. Its watch completed, its duty done. The coolness of the air intensified as the light grew, a final deep chill that seemed to be the night's last gift to the world before it surrendered to the warmth of the sun. The cold made the stone of the wall contract, and you could hear, or perhaps only imagine, the faint, crackling sounds of the masonry adjusting to the temperature change. A series of tiny, almost subliminal pops and creaks that were the voice of the wall itself, speaking in a language of stone and mortar, an ancient, patient endurance. The cold made the dew that had fallen on the battlements sparkle with a faint, crystalline light, each tiny droplet catching the first rays of the hidden sun and turning them into a miniature prism. A brief, glittering display that would vanish as soon as the warmth arrived. The cold made your breath visible, a soft white plume that rose from your lips and dissipated into the still air, and you watched the plumes form and fade, a slow, rhythmic cycle that was as regular as your heartbeat. A second bird joined the chorus, a sparrow this time, its voice a rapid, chattering series of notes that was completely different from the blackbird's clear, melodic call. The sparrow seemed more awake than the blackbird, more eager for the day to begin, and its energetic chirping added a new texture to the soundscape, a busy, bustling counterpoint to the blackbird's solitary song. A third bird, a robin perhaps, began a soft, warbling melody from somewhere near the cistern, and then a fourth, a finch, from the olive trees beyond the moat, until the air was filled with a gentle, overlapping chorus of tentative, hopeful sound. The bird song was not loud, not the full, exuberant dawn chorus that would come when the sun actually appeared. It was still cautious, still exploratory, a conversation between the early risers who were testing the silence, seeing if it was safe to sing, gradually building the confidence that would erupt into full-throated celebration when the first direct rays of sunlight touched the treetops. The city behind you was still asleep, its domes and rooftops still dark, its streets still silent, its misty valleys still filled with the pale, drifting vapor of the night's exhalation. But the light was reaching the highest points now, touching the great dome of Hagia Sophia with a faint, silvery sheen, illuminating the gilded crosses that topped the church spires with a pale, ethereal glow. The crosses caught the light like tiny beacons, their gold surfaces reflecting the hidden brightness of the eastern sky, and they seemed to float above the dark mass of the city, delicate, luminous shapes that were the first parts of Constantinople, to greet the new day. You watched them for a long moment, those distant, glowing crosses, and you felt a quiet sense of connection to the sleeping city behind you. The city that you had guarded through the long night. The city that would soon wake and begin its daily life, unaware of the quiet vigil that had kept it safe through the darkness. The distinct line of the horizon was now fully established, a sharp, clear division between the dark earth and the brightening sky, and the land below it was revealing more and more of its details with each passing minute. The individual trees in the distant olive groves were becoming visible, their twisted silver-grey trunks and their dark, rounded canopies taking shape against the pale background of the fields. The road that led to the Golden Gate, which had been invisible all night, was now a faint, pale ribbon that wound across the plain, its surface catching the light differently than the surrounding grass. A few small dark shapes were moving on the road, the earliest farmers heading toward the city with their carts, their figures tiny and distant, their presence a quiet confirmation that the world of human activity was beginning to stir. You watched them without any particular interest, simply noting their presence as another sign of the approaching day, another thread in the slow, quiet tapestry of the dawn. The outline of everything was sharper now, the world having fully emerged from the flat, shadowless darkness of the deep night into a landscape of clear forms and subtle tones. The cypress tree stood tall and distinct, its every branch defined, its dark feathery foliage a rich, textured silhouette against the pale sky. The towers of the wall were solid and massive, their limestone blocks catching the light on their eastern faces, their western faces still in deep shadow, the contrast creating a sense of three-dimensional solidity that had been absent during the night. The battlements themselves, the merlons and embrasures that you had traced with your hand so many hours ago, were now sharply defined, their edges crisp and clean, their shadows short and dark, pointing westward like a row of dark fingers. The world was no longer a dream, it was a place of solid, tangible things, a place where the light revealed and the shadow defined, a place that was ready for the sun. The first true color, a pale, delicate band of rose and gold, began to spread along the horizon, the long-awaited herald of the sun's imminent arrival. The color was soft and diffuse, a gentle wash of warmth that seemed to flow upward from the edge of the world, staining the grey sky with a blush of pink and amber and the faintest hint of orange. The color deepened as you watched, spreading outward and upward, a slow liquid bloom of light that pushed back the last remnants of the night and filled the eastern sky with a quiet, radiant promise. The clouds, which had been invisible in the darkness, were now revealed as thin, horizontal streaks of pale gold and soft lavender, their edges feathered and delicate, their undersides glowing with the reflected light of the still hidden sun. The clouds seemed to be arranged in long parallel lines, as if they were the ribs of a vast celestial fan that was slowly opening to reveal the day. The beauty of the sunrise was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was quiet and calm and deeply reassuring, a gentle, inevitable unfolding of light and color that had been happening every morning since the world began, a rhythm that asked nothing of you but to witness it. You stood at your post, your cloak wrapped tightly around you against the pre-dawn chill, your spear resting against your shoulder, your eyes fixed on the brightening eastern horizon. The night was over, or nearly so, and the long watch was drawing to its quiet, uneventful close. The world was returning, form and color and sound and life, all of it emerging from the deep, silent darkness like a sleeper waking from a dream, and you were there to see it. A quiet, steady presence on the ancient wall, a witness to the slow, beautiful birth of a new day. Footsteps on the stair announced the arrival of the next guard, a familiar face wrapped against the dawn chill, and the sound, though soft and unhurried, marked the official end of your watch. You turned from the brightening horizon and saw him emerging from the shadow of the tower stairwell, a man named Gregory, whom you had known for years. A quiet, dependable presence whose face was creased with the same lines of patient wakefulness that marked your own. He carried his spear in one hand and a small clay cup of something steaming in the other, the vapor rising from it pale and fragrant in the cold air, and he nodded to you with the easy, wordless familiarity of men who shared the same duty. The exchange that followed was brief and without ceremony, consisting of a few quiet words about nothing in particular, the coldness of the night, the clarity of the stars, the promise of a fair day ahead. Gregory commented that the plain had been quiet, and you agreed, noting that a few early carts were already on the road. He mentioned that the cook had promised fresh bread with the morning meal, and you made a small sound of appreciation, the thought of warm bread, a gentle, pleasant prospect after the long hours of stillness. The conversation was not a conversation in the usual sense. It was a ritual, a handing over of the watch that was accomplished more through presence than through words, each of you understanding without needing to explain that the wall was now his to hold and yours to leave. You handed over the post in the way that had become second nature, a simple, almost automatic sequence of small actions that marked the transition. You lifted your spear from the groove where it had rested for so many hours, feeling the familiar grain of the ashwood one last time before relinquishing it to your own care, and you stepped aside from the central position on the walkway, clearing the space for Gregory to take his place. He set his cup on the stone ledge of the battlement and positioned his spear against the familiar groove, his movements mirroring the ones you had made so many hours ago at the start of your own watch, and you watched him settle into the spot with the quiet, practiced ease of a man who had done this 1,000 times. The lamp in the niche was still burning, its flame pale and almost invisible now in the growing light, and you pointed to it, mentioning that the wick had been trimmed and the oil was sufficient until full daylight. Gregory nodded, glancing at the lamp with a look of mild, automatic acknowledgement, and then he turned his attention outward, toward the plain and the brightening sky, already assuming the quiet, watchful stillness that the post required. You lingered for a moment, not out of any reluctance to leave, but simply because the transition from watchfulness to rest was a slow one, a gradual release rather than an abrupt departure, and you allowed yourself a few more seconds of the view you had been guarding all night. Then you turned and began the descent down the worn stone steps, your sandals making the same soft, scuffing sound on the limestone that they had made during all your slow circuits of the wall. The stairs were cool and shadowed, their surfaces smoothed into gentle concavities by the centuries of feet that had climbed and descended them, and you let your hand trail along the inner wall for balance, feeling the cold, rough texture of the stone, the seams of mortar, the occasional patch of damp where the morning mist had condensed. The descent was a transition in more ways than one, a movement from the open, wind-swept height of the parapet into the enclosed, sheltered space of the inner courtyard, and as you went, you felt the weight of the watch gradually lifting from your shoulders, a slow, pleasant easing of the quiet alertness that had sustained you through the night. Your body, which had been held in a state of gentle, persistent readiness, began to relax, your muscles loosening, your breathing deepening, your thoughts drifting away from the wall and the plain and the stars toward the simpler, more immediate concerns of the morning. You emerged from the stairwell into the courtyard between the walls, a broad open space that was just beginning to stir with the first activities of the new day. The garrison was waking up, its nighttime silence giving way to the soft, shuffling sounds of morning routine, the clink of a bucket being drawn from a well, the low murmur of voices from the guardhouse, the scrape of a wooden door being pushed open. The smell of wood smoke drifted from the kitchen chimney, sharp and clean and promising, and somewhere a rooster crowed, its voice a brazen, triumphant announcement that the night was officially over. A few guards were already moving about, their faces still puffy with sleep, their cloaks wrapped tightly against the morning chill, and they nodded to you as you passed, the same quiet, wordless acknowledgement that you had shared with the gatekeeper at the start of your watch, a recognition of shared duty and shared fatigue. You nodded back, your steps carrying you past the supply carts and the stacked barrels of provisions, past the small walled garden where the cook grew herbs in the summer, past the low stone building that housed the watch officer's quarters, its door still closed, its occupant presumably still asleep. You passed through the inner gate, the same gate you had entered so many hours ago, and stepped out into the streets of Constantinople. The city was waking around you, its nighttime hush dissolving into the gentle rising hum of daily life, and you walked through it with the quiet, detached contentment of a man who had done his work and was now free to rest. The streets, which had been dark and empty when you made your way to the wall, were now filled with the soft, golden light of early morning, the sun having just cleared the hills of Asia and begun its slow climb into the pale blue sky. The light fell on the stone facades of the houses and the worn cobblestones of the streets, casting long, warm shadows that stretched westward, and it touched the upper branches of the plane trees and the cypresses, turning their leaves into a shimmering canopy of green and gold. The first shops were opening as you walked, their wooden shutters being folded back by hands that moved with the slow, deliberate pace of early morning. A baker was pulling loaves from a clay oven, the bread, brown and crusty and steaming, its scent filling the narrow street with a rich, yeasty warmth that made your stomach murmur in anticipation. He glanced up as you passed, his face red from the heat of the oven, and he offered you a brief, flowery wave, a gesture of recognition that you returned with a small nod. Further down the street, a vegetable seller was arranging her produce on a wooden cart, piling green cucumbers and dark purple aubergines and bright yellow lemons into neat, colorful mounds, their skins still beaded with the moisture of the morning dew. A donkey laden with sacks of grain ambled past you, its driver walking alongside with a stick resting loosely on his shoulder, the animal's hooves making a steady, clopping rhythm on the cobblestones, a sound that echoed softly between the close-set walls of the houses. The city was coming alive in the way that it always did at this hour, a slow, gentle awakening that was not hurried or frantic, but seemed to unfold with the same patient, inevitable rhythm as the sunrise itself. The church bells began to ring in the distance, a single, clear note from somewhere near the Forum of Constantine, followed by a deeper, more sonorous tolling from the direction of Hagia Sophia, their voices overlapping and blending into a simple, resonant melody that floated over the rooftops and echoed through the narrow streets. The bells marked the beginning of the morning liturgy, calling the faithful to prayer, and you knew that inside the great churches the candles were being lit, the incense was being prepared, the priests were donning their vestments, the same rituals that had been performed every morning for centuries, a quiet, sacred counterpart to the secular rhythms of the waking city. You passed a small chapel tucked between two larger buildings, its door open, its interior a dim, golden cave of candlelight and incense smoke. The sound of chanting drifted out into the street, a single voice this time, a tenor that rose and fell in a slow, plaintive melody, the words Greek and indistinct, but the tone clear and deeply peaceful. You paused for a moment, not to enter but simply to listen, letting the sound wash over you, a quiet, beautiful thread of human devotion that seemed to belong as much to the morning as the birdsong and the sunlight. The chant continued, the voice rising to a high sustained note and then descending in a series of soft, melismatic steps, and you felt a small, quiet sense of gratitude for the presence of such things, for the continuity of prayer and song and ritual that had shaped the life of the city for so many generations. You resumed your walk, your pace slow and easy, your body beginning to feel the pleasant heaviness of approaching sleep. The gilded crosses and finials that topped the city's churches and palaces were now catching the full light of the rising sun, their gold surfaces blazing with a warm, brilliant radiance that made them look like flames frozen in mid-flicker. The cross on the dome of Hagia Sophia was the brightest of them all, a single shining point of light that seemed to float above the dark mass of the building, a beacon of gold against the pale blue sky. The sight was familiar, one you had seen countless times before, but it never lost its quiet power, its ability to lift your thoughts above the small concerns of the day and remind you of the larger, more enduring things that the city represented. You watched it for a moment, that distant, glowing cross, and then you turned down a narrow side street, leaving the main thoroughfare and entering the quiet, residential neighborhood where your small room awaited. The street was narrow and shadowed, the buildings on either side leaning so close that their upper stories almost touched, and the sunlight fell in thin, diagonal shafts through the gaps, illuminating the worn flagstones and the potted herbs that sat on the windowsills. A cat was sitting on a doorstep, washing its face with a slow, meticulous paw, and it paused to look at you with calm green eyes before returning to its grooming, utterly indifferent to your passage. The smell of cooking drifted from an open window, onions and garlic and something sweet, perhaps honey or wine, and a woman's voice was singing softly somewhere nearby, a simple, repetitive melody that was half lullaby and half work song. The sounds and smells of domestic life were a comfort, a reminder that the world you had guarded through the night was a world of small, peaceful things, of meals and songs and sleeping children, of quiet, ordinary existence that asked nothing more than to be allowed to continue. You reached the door of your lodging house, a modest two-story building with a faded wooden sign and a small walled courtyard where a single fig tree grew. The door was unlocked, as it always was during the day, and you pushed it open and stepped inside, the cool, dim interior a welcome relief after the brightening streets. The atrium was quiet, the water clock in the corner still dripping its slow, steady rhythm, the same sound that had accompanied your departure so many hours ago and now accompanied your return. The household was still asleep, the other lodgers not yet stirring, and you climbed the narrow stairway to your room with slow, deliberate steps, your hand trailing along the smooth, worn banister. Your room was small and simple. A single window that looked out onto the courtyard, a narrow bed with a wool-stuffed mattress, a wooden chest for your belongings, a small clay lamp on a shelf. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the window, casting a pale golden rectangle on the plaster wall. You set your spear in the corner, unbuckled your sandals and placed them beside the door, and hung your cloak on the wooden peg where it lived during the day. The cloak was cold and slightly damp from the night air, its familiar weight now lifted from your shoulders, and you felt a small, pleasant lightness, a sense of release that came from shedding the last piece of your watch. You lay down on the bed, the mattress rustling softly beneath you, and pulled the wool blanket up to your chin. The pillow was cool and smelled faintly of lavender, a small unexpected luxury, and you turned your head to look out the window at the patch of sky visible above the courtyard wall. The sky was a soft, pale blue now, completely clear, and the last of the morning mist was dissolving in the warmth of the sun. The fig tree in the courtyard was stirring in a light breeze, its broad leaves rustling with a soft, papery sound, and a sparrow was perched on one of its branches, chirping its rapid, cheerful song. You watched the sparrow for a while, your eyes growing heavy, your breathing slowing, your body sinking deeper into the mattress with each passing moment. The thought came to you, as it always did at the end of a watch, that you had kept the city safe through another night simply by being there, awake and still. The wall had held, the plain had been quiet, the city had slept, and now the sun was up, and the world was continuing, and you had played your small, quiet part in that continuity. The thought was not a proud one. It was simply a recognition of something true, a quiet, satisfying fact that settled into your mind like a stone settling into the earth. You closed your eyes, and the sounds of the waking city faded into a soft, distant hum, the bells and the birdsong and the distant murmur of voices blending into a single, gentle lullaby. Your breathing deepened, your body relaxed, and you let yourself drift, slowly and peacefully, into the deep, dreamless sleep that always came at the end of a long, quiet watch on the walls of Constantinople.